The Phantom Archives of Edgar the Architect, and Schale by Gen Kagami. Volume 11, Lesser de Palmera, The Atlantic Boundary, The Brine of Lesser. Untethered from the concept of time, the genius architect Edgar and the pearl-haired youth Schale wander through eternity, retaining their youthful, exquisite forms. Across eras, they traverse the world's renowned architectural works and the maddening constructs Edgar himself once assembled. This is a tranquil, decadent journey through phantom architecture, dissecting space, light, gravity, and the anomalies lurking within through cold, unflinching logic. 1. Atlantic light and the porcelain frame. A suffocating scent of brine and the almost violent radiance of the Atlantic. Lesser de Palmera, northern Portugal. Amidst the rugged, rocky terrain, the fresh concrete lines drawn by a young architect shimmered with a blinding intensity, reflecting the fierce summer sun. It was a summer where a certain optimistic air of a bygone era drifted within the colours and silhouettes of the bather's attire. Down a brand new concrete ramp leading from the scorching asphalt road toward the shore, two young men descended in silence. Even beneath the relentless southern European sun, Edgar showed not a single mote of disarray in his appearance. Directly against his skin, he wore a high-gauge, short-sleeved knit, woven from a blend of the finest summer woolen silk, combed to extreme fineness. Depending on the angle of the light, threads of a dark navy with a hint of blue and cold charcoal interwove with obsessive density, presenting an overall hue of a bottomless dark purple, like the midnight abyss of the sea. His perfectly creased raw linen trousers and the slender loafers on his feet severed his silhouette, that of a mature, chilling youth, frozen in eternity, utterly from the surrounding clamour. Following slightly behind with a languid stride was Schale. He too possessed the frame of a beautiful youth, precarious yet perfected, a fitting companion to Edgar. His body was enveloped in a thin, open-collar shirt. Its warp was of pure white silk with a mother-of-pearl lustre, and its weft was of an extremely fine, pale grey linen. Whenever it caught the breeze, the two-coloured threads overlapped to emit a ghostly sheen of pearl grey akin to morning mist or bone ash, vividly revealing the wax-white lines of his slender shoulders. Two beautiful youths who would never age. Their footsteps echoed quietly upon the pristine concrete, not yet eroded by the sea breeze. The roar of the waves is immense, yet the sea remains entirely hidden. It feels as though we are being teased. Schale narrowed his eyes, shielding them with long fingers emerging from his pearl-grey cuffs. That is the architect's method, Edgar replied without looking back, his voice quiet yet definitive, dominating the space. He erects concrete walls to sever the view between the road and the ocean. He forces a profound awareness of the sea through sound and scent alone, while robbing us of the visual. Come, we shall pass through the womb now. 2. Darkness of the corridor and the released rocks. As Edgar had predicted, once they reached the bottom of the ramp, they stepped into a dark corridor sheltered by a low concrete roof, a narrow space lined with changing rooms and showers. After the brilliance of the south, their vision was abruptly shuttered by darkness. The air of the chilled shade, the scent of wet tiles, chlorine and intense brine, the presence of raw, living flesh saturated the space between the walls. It was the moment they emerged from that dim, compressed conduit. Crack! The horizon of the vast Atlantic and the violent sunlight exploded into their vision. Their pupils, which had contracted to their limit in the darkness, shrieked at the overwhelming torrent of light and colour. Ah! Schale instinctively narrowed his eyes, shielding his face with the sleeve of his pearl-grey shirt. Spreading below them was a gargantuan seaside pool, constructed by utilising the raw, natural rock formations and allowing only low concrete lines to crawl geometrically across them. This was the birth of Alvaro Caesar's masterpiece, the lesser swimming pool. Natural stone and man-made concrete intermingled as if melting their boundaries, and upon the water's surface crowded a throng of multicoloured bathers enjoying the fresh holiday resort. Cheers, the thunder of breaking waves and the scent of sun-baked wet skin. It was a suffocating fever of life. A dramatic liberation following visual deprivation, and the taming of savage nature into a human scale with a single line of concrete. A magnificent purposefulness. Edgar crossed his arms over his dark purple knit and looked down chillily at the frenzy below. Within his jet-black eyes there was no interest in the jubilant humans. He saw only the perfection of the lines that composed the space. However, this overwhelming heat is somewhat off-putting. Come, Schale. Let us take refuge in the neighbouring restaurant before we are overwhelmed by the crowd. 3. Rising steps and the overlapping horizon. To escape the immense clamour of the pool, the two headed toward the adjacent Boenova tea house. However, Caesar's architecture does not simply invite a guest inside. To reach the entrance of the restaurant from the low rocky path, one had to ascend an external staircase built of whitewashed walls and stone. We are heading to a seaside restaurant, yet we are climbing. Schale ascended the dry stone steps one by one, allowing the hem of his pearl-grey shirt to play in the sea breeze. An ascending circulation built toward the sea. Looking up, the southern European sky stretched infinitely high. But the white walls and rock faces on either side narrowed the field of vision. The full expanse of the Atlantic remained hidden. Only the roar of the surf and the scent of brine stubbornly announced the ocean's proximity. This, too, is the perfect control of space. Edgar's deep, dark purple loafers stepped firmly upon the stone. This ascent thoroughly teases the human desire to see the ocean. And look at that landing. At the moment Schale reached the top of the stairs, an unbelievable sight appeared. The straight line of the landing step and the horizon of the Atlantic stretching beyond it overlapped with absolute precision, becoming one. Oh! The moment when a geometric line crafted by man becomes perfectly assimilated with nature's horizon. Caesar calculated this miraculous optical illusion to the finest degree to determine the angle and height of these stairs. Edgar traced that perfect line with a chilled yet clearly admiring gaze, and immediately after savouring that exquisite appetizer of overlapping horizons, the two passed through the heavy wooden door of the entrance. There the environment inverted into a dim, narrow, descending indoor staircase, enveloped in the heavy grain of African Aphelia wood. Utterly severed from the glare outside, they descended as if diving into the sea, and in the dining room that followed, beneath a ceiling pressed low, the Atlantic horizon, framed like a panoramic painting, was suddenly and violently released. 4. Green wine and the grain of the tide. An exquisite compression and release of space. The frenzy outside feels like a lie. Edgar sat by the window facing the sea, murmuring quietly. His summer wool knit, which maintained its bottomless dark purple even in the southern light, sank into the polished black wooden chair. Opposite him Schale, in his thin pearl-grey linen shirt, stared vacantly at the white caps of the Atlantic through the glass. Before long, a waiter brought well-chilled Vino Verde green wine and a marinade of fresh seafood. The pale gold, slightly effervescent liquid hissed and popped with tiny bubbles in the glass held by Edgar's long fingers. Edgar, is it just me, or is the wood grain above moving? Schale looked up, a hint of doubt in his voice as he was about to take a sip. Above them, the Afzelia wood panelling of the ceiling pressed down low and heavy. Its reddish-brown grain had begun to describe strange, undulating ripples, as if synchronized with the sea outside. V. Geometry shedding reason. Creak. Groan. The raw sound of wood groaning began to echo through the serene restaurant. Edgar placed his glass on the table and quietly watched the ceiling, which appeared to be undulating and gradually descending, with his cold, jet-black eyes. To force the space toward the horizon, the ceiling was suppressed to its absolute limit. That mechanical stress and the energy of the raging sea outside are causing a short circuit within the skeleton of this young architecture. A self-derisive smile, tinged with a hint of hedonistic pleasure, flickered at the corner of Edgar's mouth. No, at this stage, Scissor himself surely hasn't realized the magnificence of the ceiling, Edgar stated definitively. Unlike floors or walls, a ceiling, which acts as a lid over the human head, can, at times, cause an illusion of gravity itself, directly amplifying the madness of a space. The unconscious runaway energy of Scissor's youth before he became possessed by its terror and beauty in later years was now manifesting here as an anomaly. Schale, it is coming. Edgar spoke in a voice that was low yet vibrated through the space. Geometry has shed its reason. The moment those words fell, the thick wooden ceiling above began to heave violently. The wood grains swirled, and the perspective of their vision was utterly warped. Beams that should have intersected at right angles bent pliantly. The entire space began to contract and expand like the stomach of a gargantuan sea creature attempting to swallow them whole. Yet, Edgar did not move. He did not even issue an arrogant declaration to subdue the space. He merely leaned back deep into his chair, arms crossed, looking up chillily at the raging waves of wood grain as if watching a supreme performance. The pure energy of space is simply spilling over, exceeding the young architect's intent. We need only receive it. Showing not a mote of fear, Edgar quietly drained the effervescent Vino Verde down his throat. Schale too followed Edgar's lead, holding his breath and continuing to watch the undulating ceiling. Finally, at the moment, a particularly large wave struck the rocks outside and white spray lashed against the window. The frenzy of the ceiling subsided, as if it had been a lie, the heat of the space receding. The wood grain regained its straight lines, the beams intersected correctly at right angles, and the environment returned to its heavy, serene form of architecture. It's over. Schale let out a long, slow breath. The dining room was as silent as if nothing had happened. Edgar placed his empty glass on the table and returned his gaze to the horizon outside, looking satisfied. Yes, it was the beautiful sleep-talking of a young genius. The 6. Sculpture of the Sea Breeze. The finish, named Time. Leaving the Boanova tea house after the phantom of the undulating wood grain had vanished, the sun had already begun to set, and the Atlantic wind had cooled slightly. Amidst the intense orange light dyeing the sea and sky, the two began to walk slowly along the path tracing the rocks. Schale's pearl-grey linen shirt caught the sea breeze, billowing softly. Walking beside him, Edgar's dark purple summer wool absorbed the twilight glow, appearing even deeper in hue, sharply bordering his cold, statue-like silhouette. That was delicious, but a terribly exhausting lunch. You told me to receive it, and I nearly got seasick from the waves, Schale grumbled while stretching his limbs. Edgar gave a thin smile and used his long fingers to lightly press down his jet-black fringe, which was about to be mussed by the wind. Exceptional spaces at times directly stroke the human nerves, but it seems the raw madness of the young Caesar ends here. Look, there stands an architecture built upon an entirely different logic. Edgar directed his gaze toward a small white building standing alone atop a jagged rock face. The Boa Nova Chapel, once part of a monastery. Its exterior walls, coated in pure white stucco, had been carved by centuries of salt-laden Atlantic gales. The plaster had peeled away in places, revealing the rugged stone beneath. The small cross atop the roof tilted slightly, bearing the scars of the merciless violence known as weathering across its entire form. It's quite dilapidated. Compared to Caesar's linear concrete, it looks like a toy shack. It may look that way to you, but that is another truth of architecture. Edgar stopped and stared at the small chapel standing beyond the sea spray, with eyes that were quiet and profoundly transparent. Young Caesar sought to carve out the violence of nature with human intellect by drawing robust concrete lines. But that little chapel is different. It abandoned the fight against nature and chose simply to be. And what do you think happened as a result? Edgar pointed to the whitewashed walls that had been perpetually exposed to the sea breeze. Unimaginable years, the salt and wind from the sea, they have carved the corners of that building, stripped the stucco, and utterly assimilated it with the surrounding rocks. Upon the stone box assembled by man, a merciless carpenter named Time has applied the final finish, the patina. In his definitive voice, there was a tinge of quiet respect, distinct from his evaluation of the young genius. From the moment an architecture rises from a blueprint, it begins to walk toward death, toward deterioration. Yet, that process of weathering toward death is precisely what promises a true depth to the space and its indigeneity to the landscape. The beauty of an architecture finished by time is something no genius's geometry can rival. 7. Twilight of Those Without Clocks. Edgar's words were swallowed by the thunder of the breaking waves. Schale narrowed his eyes against the wind, a slightly sorrowful smile playing upon his lips. Time applies the final finish, does it? That is something we can never possess. Schale's wax-white fingertips touched the chest of his pearl-grey shirt. Their flesh would never weather. Not a single wrinkle would be etched upon them. They were beings rejected by the finish named time. Terribly perfect, yet eternally incomplete. Indeed, we are nothing more than old, unbuilt plans, frozen forever upon a blueprint. Edgar's quiet affirmation. He took a deep breath and turned his face toward the Atlantic horizon, which was beginning to glow red with the setting sun. His dark purple knit, woven of extremely fine threads, billowed slightly with the movement of his deathless chest. But because of that, we are able to accurately measure the beauty of their decay. This cruel privilege is the only entertainment permitted to us. Come, the sun is setting. Let us return to the city before the sea breeze grows too cold. The shadows of the two stretched long and incredibly dark across the rugged Portuguese rocks. Between the brand new concrete and the weathered white chapel, amidst the falling twilight, the two young men, who would never age, walked away quietly, without a sound. End of Volume 11. The Phantom Archives of Edgar the Architect, and Schale by Gen Kagami. Volume 12. The Muddy Water of Water Lilies. The structure of the Tan Tuan Bridge. Untethered from the concept of time, the genius architect Edgar and the pearl-haired youth Schale wander through eternity, retaining their youthful, exquisite forms. Across eras, they traverse the world's renowned architectural works and the maddening constructs Edgar himself once assembled. This is a tranquil, decadent journey through phantom architecture, dissecting space, light, gravity, and the anomalies lurking within through cold, unflinching logic. 1. The chalk-white dragons and the dynastic wind. What obstructed their breath was a heavy, saturated wall of atmosphere, approaching 100% humidity. To the very edges of their vision, the scenery melted into a milky white fog. Due to the tremendous effect of atmospheric perspective, even the silhouettes of palm trees a mere dozen meters away wavered ambiguously, like the faded brushstrokes of an ink-wash painting. In this scorching midday heat, there was not a single living soul upon the thoroughfare. Upon the turbid surface of the canal, the bamboo frames of lift nets left behind by fishermen pierced the white, hazy air like the legs of gargantuan spiders. Ordinarily, silverfish should have been leaping, but beneath this murderous thermal mass, even the shadows of the crossbeams suspending the nets refused to move. There is no one here. It feels as though the world has sunk into hot, muddy water, Edgar. Schale gripped the collar of his pearl-coloured tunic shirt, woven with threads of gold, and narrowed his eyes in discomfort. Drops of condensation from the atmosphere slid slowly down the nape of the supple youth's neck. Naturally, not even the laws of the dynasty can bind this tropical sun. They are likely sleeping as if dead in the shadows of their earthen floors right now. Edgar, wearing his dark green Ramie shirt with impeccable neatness, fixed his chilling eyes straight ahead. Beyond the milky white atmosphere, piercing through the fog, the structure vividly revealed its form. The Tan Tuan Bridge. Barely a year since its completion, the bridge was astonishingly white and dazzling. The chalk-white plaster walls supporting the roof were devoid of a single speck of dirt, reflecting the sun's rays with brilliance. The twin dragon ornaments glaring at the heavens from the roof's peak gleamed with freshly applied, richly coloured paint, emitting a slick lustre as if they were alive within the heat haze. A magnificent specimen. Its skeleton structure is so utterly exposed that it is almost inappropriate to call it architecture. The Tan Tuan Bridge. If Western bridges stride across rivers with the rigidity of stone, this one attempts to pin down this clinging air with the heavy mass of wood and roof tiles. Edgar's loafers trod upon the brick road surface, not yet worn down by the rain. It is not architecture. It is a gargantuan exhaust structure designed to churn the tropical moisture and forcefully draw the wind through. 2. The quickening of whispers. It was immediately after the two attempted to proceed further. From beyond the milky white atmosphere, from the direction of that new structure, where silence should have reigned, a murmuring, low, earth-rumbling sound began to be heard. I hear something. Voices chatting? And it's not just one or two people. As the two drew closer to the bridge, the sound began to take shape. Laughter, the crying of infants, the low, viscous conversations of the elderly. Shall we go, Schale? To the only place permitted as an escape from this scorching prison that paradise forged by the mercy of its donor. Edgar's dark green Ramie shirt created a slight waver in the air with every step. Where he directed his chilling gaze, the chalk-white Tantuam bridge, pregnant with the murmur of the people, waited quietly for the two. 3. A colony of ladybugs and the donor's mercy. The moment he stepped beneath its roof, Schale gasped involuntarily. Ah, so many people. Everyone was here. Inside the bridge, in stark contrast to the milky white light outside, a deep darkness stagnated, and filling that darkness were the inhabitants of this village. They were sitting, lying down, or nursing infants, layered upon one another on the long wooden benches installed along both sides of the bridge. Their dense congregation looked exactly like a colony of ladybugs clinging together in one spot on the underside of a leaf to escape the intense summer sun. There is no need for surprise. To them, this bridge is not a civil engineering structure for mere passage. It is the village well, the living room, and a gargantuan lung to sustain their respiration. Edgar's quiet, definitive voice melted into the whispers of the people. In the centre of the bridge, before a slightly elevated altar, several women knelt quietly, offering incense. It was a prayer of gratitude to the woman who had once donated this bridge, Tran Ti Dao. She discarded her personal greed and dedicated this structure to the village. For a woman who bore no children, the people utilising this bridge were surely her own flesh and blood. Look, Schale. What supports this bridge are not merely pillars of ironwood. It is the invisible, robust beams forged from centuries of human gratitude and the casual conversations of daily life. Edgar allowed a faint heat to tinge his dark purple eyes as he slowly traced the space overflowing with the vitality of the people. The humidity was 100%. The inescapable heat mingled with the body temperatures of the people, filling the structure with the dense, pungent scent of life. Here lies the true function that Western architects so often overlook. Architecture should not be a mere box to ward off the wind and rain. It must be a device, method, to tether human lives together in this manner. 4. Paradise in the shade. Stepping one pace deeper into the interior of the structure, it was indeed a paradise. The milky white light brought about by the atmospheric perspective outside was blocked by the layers of old tiled roofs, and the eye-searing sting was neutralized into soft, deep shadows. The wind blowing across the canal was cooled ever so slightly as it passed between the ironwood pillars, caressing the skin of the people. Ah, I feel revived. It's like heaven in here. Schale let his pearl-coloured shirt, threaded with gold, flutter as he sat on the edge of a bench. Beside him, old women laughed merrily while spitting the red juice of betel nuts, and the sound of men striking pieces on a wooden board echoed like a rhythmic beat. The scent of agar wood drifting from somewhere, the smell of dried fish, and the body heat of the people. All of these filled the space not as putrefaction, but as the mature aroma of daily life, an equilibrium of life that transcends calculation, method. Edgar beautifully folded back the sleeves of his dark green Ramie shirt, gazing upon the clamour of the people as if cherishing it. No matter how much Western architects rack their brains, they cannot design this tranquility of density. They attempt to control the air with air conditioning systems, but this structure incorporates the very respiration of the people into its skeleton. Schale, it is not solely because of the wind that this bridge is cool. The emotion of security among the humans gathered here lowers the temperature of the atmosphere by several degrees. A rare, gentle light dwelled within Edgar's jet-black eyes. Possessing the mature air of his late 20s, he affirmed their existence without needing to blend into the circle of their lives. It was the pure respect of an architect for a space where its function was being correctly fulfilled. V. The structure shedding reason. However, when tranquility reaches its extreme limit, the distortion of space creeps in soundlessly. 100% humidity, the breaths of the people, the vapour of the muddy water, and the smoke of agar wood flowing from the central altar. It was the moment all of these reached saturation, exceeding the processing capacity of this structure. Edgar, look! The people. They are disappearing. At Schale's whisper, Edgar cast his gaze around. The silhouettes of the people who had been chatting so merrily were beginning to waver unnaturally. No, they were not disappearing. Their shadows were slowly seeping into the wood grain of the benches they sat upon, and the pillars supporting them, beginning to assimilate. It is coming, Schale. The structure is beginning to drown in the soft hallucination dream known as humanity. Edgar's quiet, definitive voice announced the anomaly. Creak. Groan. The gargantuan ironwood skeleton supporting the bridge began to pulsate, as if sucking the body heat from the people and transmuting it into its own flesh and blood. Upon the surface of the pillars, patterns resembling the wrinkles of the old men who had just been laughing emerged, and the beams let out high-pitched squeaks like the birth cries of infants. A paradise that is far too splendid sometimes refuses to let its inhabitants leave. It seems the mercy of the donor, Tran has endowed this structure with an excessive monopoly. Edgar chillily stroked the skin of the writhing pillar with his gloved hand. The structural body has forgotten its rigidity, hardness, and is dreaming of the softness of human flesh. Schale, do not move. If you take a step now, your porcelain limbs will also be rewritten into the floorboards. Parts of this bridge, the entire bridge repeated slow contractions, like the depths of the throat of a gargantuan beast. Outside, the lift nets repeatedly rose and fell at an unnatural speed, as if acting as pumps to aid the respiration of this structure. Beyond the milky white atmosphere, the real world receded, and only the closed paradise named Tan Tuan Bridge continued to mutter to itself amidst the dense humidity. A beautiful hell, isn't it, Edgar? Indeed. This is the ultimate end when architecture falls in love with humanity. As the structure swallowed the shadows of the people and the ironwood pillars writhed with sounds like birth cries, the two merely watched the spectacle in silence. They offered no hand of resolution, nor did they condemn its fanatical possessiveness. Architecture dreams, and humans become a part of it. That too is merely one form of harmony, balance that this tropical wetland had arrived at over centuries. The moment the smoke of the agarwood painted their vision white, and the laughter of the people was completely replaced by the creaking of timber, the two slipped soundlessly out from the stomach-named paradise. 6. The reverberation of the finale. Countless motorbike lights flowed like shooting stars through the indigo of the dusk. The second-floor terrace seating of the restaurant Golden Rice. Schale undid one more button of his pearl-grey silk shirt, narrowing his eyes at the breeze sent from the electric fan at his feet. On the ceiling, an old ceiling fan slowly churned the atmosphere with a constant rhythm. Phew! Compared to that bridge, this wind of civilization is quite rational. Edgar, still impeccably dressed in his dark green Ramie shirt, reached for the well-chilled beer on the table. A lukewarm yet comforting breeze passed through the terrace. The oscillating fan quietly fluttered Schale's pearl-coloured shirt with a rhythmic, mechanical sound, faintly trembling the cold drops of condensation on Edgar's glass. The clamour and the silence. The past and the present. In the wind that ambiguously stitched it all together, they now simply surrendered themselves. It's a good wind, Edgar. Yes, until this wind stops, let us remain merely travellers. End of Volume 12. The Phantom Archives of Edgar the Architect and Schale by Gen Kagami. Volume 13. Ava. The Box of Silence. The Guillotine of Light at La Tourette. Part 1. Untethered from the concept of time, the genius architect Edgar and the pearl-haired youth Schale wander through eternity, retaining their youthful, exquisite forms. Across eras, they traverse the world's renowned architectural works and the maddening constructs Edgar himself once assembled. This is a tranquil, decadent journey through phantom architecture, dissecting space, light, gravity, and the anomalies lurking within through cold, unflinching logic. 1. The demonic charm of white peaches and the blood of the roasted slope. When the veil of night painted the surface of the Rhône in a viscous black, and the steep vineyards on both banks cast dark, spectral shadows, a room in an old auberge in Condrieu was saturated with a suffocating, demonic fragrance. The flame of the candle lit upon the table bewitchingly licked the raven-black velvet jacket worn by Edgar. Deep within the jet-black raised nap that swallowed the light, his cold eyes were fixed upon a crystal glass. Opposite him, Schale had slightly opened the chest of his raw silk chiffon blouse, leaking feverish sighs. As he tilted the glass with fingers like white wax, the golden liquid caught the light in a viscous, sluggish reflection like melted amber. Beautiful colour. The suffocating scent of white flowers and white peaches just on the verge of over-ripening and falling. It's almost terrifyingly sweet. It feels as though the marrow of my brain is growing numb. That is the demonic charm of the Viognier grape, Edgar whispered in a quiet yet definitive voice that seemed to dominate the space. It is not merely sweet. Clinging to the harsh, sheer rock faces of the Rhône slopes, it converts all its tenacity for survival method into this single drop of nectar. The cold, stony minerality supports this golden liquid with a bottomless, chilling dread. However, Schale, once you taste this red, that harshness will transform into the most exquisite blood. Poured next into the glass was a red côte rôtie. The dark red liquid settled at the bottom of the glass like a heavy, oppressive flame. Côte rôtie, the roasted slope. The black Syrah grape sucks up the heat of the scorched earth, baked by a sun bordering on violent, from the very depths of the ground. It possesses the fierce aroma of iron rust, raw beast flesh, and black pepper. Yet the winemaker blends in just a few % of the white Viognier from before. Do you not find it a terrifying purposefulness? The rough, violent energy of the earth is tuned to the utmost limits of sensuality by those few drops of white, cloaking it in the suffocating fragrance of violets. As if mesmerized, Schale brought his thin lips to the glass and took in the blood-like red. The stimulus of scorched beast blood and black pepper intertwined with the crayfish sauce vermilion gore of the quenelle, served upon pure white porcelain, sweetly and violently trampling the reason of the two. In silence they continued to pour that ecstasy which could well be called the most exquisite poison into their eternal bodies. 2. the meandering mountain road, and the woodpecker's forest. The retribution for this arrived when the white sun of the following day had fully ascended to its zenith, covering their sheets in a terribly heavy, oppressive languor. My head aches, Edgar. It feels as though last night's red sauce and heavy wine are still crawling through my veins, Schale murmured in a husky voice, his dishevelled, pearl-coloured hair pressed against the pillar. It is the natural price for indulging your 5 senses to their absolute limit. Edgar stood by the window, looking down at the blinding sunlight of the Rhône. He had already immaculately donned his vintage jet-black cavalry twill coat, its collar turned up sharply along his jawline. We were scheduled to descend to the city of Lyon, but I have changed my mind. To drag this languor into that stomach of gastronomy and clamour would be to wallow too deeply in the mundane. A more extreme detoxification is required. We head northwest from here, to the forest of Eveux. Boarding their car, the two avoided the boorish, flat main roads, intentionally choosing the rustic lower paths. The car departed from the banks of the Rhône, gradually thrusting its nose into mountain roads that grew narrow and undulated like a serpent. The dense canopy of tree branches covered the sky above, and with every sharp curve, the chassis creaked left and right. As the altitude increased, the aphrodisiac-like humidity and heat of the previous night were entirely stripped away, and air as cold and honed as a needle slipped into the cabin through the gaps of the open windows. Eventually, the car plunged into the bosom of a deep forest. When the engine was killed, there was an overwhelming silence. Tap, tap, tap. Far in the distance, from the bottom of the cold atmosphere, only the dry sound of a woodpecker piercing tree bark echoed at equal intervals. The air is terribly taut. The scent of wine from just moments ago has vanished as if it were a lie. Schale let out a breath clouded white with cold, gathering the ultra-thin mohair wool cardigan, the colour of a dove's wing, closer around himself, because this is the entrance to silence. Edgar's black leather shoes trod upon the damp, fallen leaves, where he directed his chilling gaze. Emerging from the grove of trees echoing with the woodpecker's tapping, it suddenly revealed itself, as if utterly rejecting the soft nature surrounding it. The concrete gravestone left behind by the maestro, Le Corbusier. The convent of Sainte-Marie de la Tourette lay deathly silent beneath a leaden sky, like a gargantuan blade of geometry. 3. The membrane of collage and the submarine door. The two alighted from the car and stepped into the grassy courtyard plaza wet with morning dew. The damp undergrowth was crushed beneath their soles, sending up a suffocating green scent. Yet, as if to reject that breath of the wild head-on, a colossal concrete precipice loomed before their eyes. It's strange, Edgar. Even though it is such a massive block of concrete, it doesn't look the least bit heavy. Schale looked up dubiously, shielding himself from the cold wind with the sleeve of his dove-wing-coloured mohair cardigan. Where he gazed, the walls of the monastery looked unbelievably thin. The concrete, which should have been a robust structure withstanding gravity, rose up as unreliably as drawing paper or thin silk, with irregular square openings haphazardly punched through it, like a cut-out collage. It is a visual deception method planted by Corbusier. Edgar deepened his chilling smile at the collar of his jet-black vintage cavalry twill coat. The deep black fabric that swallowed light sharply contrasted with the faded grey of the concrete. He hid the skeleton of pillars inside, floating the outer walls in mid-air as mere membranes. It is a perfect rebellion against Gothic architecture, which demonstrated the majesty of God through the crushing weight of thick stone. By erasing gravity and punching cut-out holes into walls as thin as paper, this gargantuan box floats within the landscape with an eerie, violent lightness. Edgar's leather shoes left the grass and stepped onto the inorganic concrete floor of the cloister. Countless geometric shadows cast cold stripes across their beautiful faces. Soon the two reached the entrance to the chapel. What awaited there was the antithesis of the paper-thin outer walls. A terrifyingly thick, heavy, rotating metal door. A submarine hatch, or the door to a massive bank vault. Schale slid his wax-white fingers across the cold metal surface. Indeed, it is an airtight door, meant to completely seal off the mundane air from this point onward. Beyond here is the deep sea, where one must breathe only silence instead of oxygen. Hold your breath, Schale. Edgar extended his long arm and pushed the heavy door open. The hinges let out a low, heavy birth cry, and the entrance to the concrete womb slowly opened its mouth. 4. Exposed viscera and the resonating prayer. The moment they crossed the threshold and stepped into the dim interior of the chapel, where light scarcely reached, an absolute pre-established harmony of silence should have enveloped them. However, what violently struck their eardrums was not silence, but a torrent of sound that shook the very air. Amen. It was the monks practicing their hymns. A gargantuan rectangular space built of exposed concrete beton brute, utterly devoid of ornamentation. Within that box, completely stripped of any escape route for sound, the low, thick voices of men layered upon each other, crashed against the walls, crawled across the floor, and poured down from the ceiling, becoming a tremendous reverberation that shook the entire space. Such immense sound pressure. It feels as though the air is physically slamming into my skin. Schale furrowed his brow as if enduring pain and covered his ears. The thin mohair fabric trembled faintly under the sonic waves. An unscheduled welcome, but not bad. No, rather, it is an exquisite surprise. Edgar stood perfectly still, taking the violence of the sound head-on, with both hands thrust into his coat pockets. Within his jet-black eyes, a quiet ecstasy toward the overwhelming mechanics of the space flared up. Whereas Gothic churches sublimated the voice of God into celestial music through the soft reverberation of stone, this concrete box is different, completely discarding the concept of acoustic absorption. It hurls the raw, muddy humanity of the human voice directly against the space as a solid mass of sound. The melody of the hymn stroked the rough texture of the walls, seeping deep into the marrow of the two youths' bones. This is no mere empty box. It is a gargantuan concrete viscera designed to resonate and amplify the sonic waves known as prayer. Look, Schale! The invisible blood called sound is circulating to every corner of this inorganic box, and the architecture itself is beginning a ragged respiration. True to Edgar's words, the heavy concrete skin appeared to pulse like a living creature, swayed by the waves of the hymn, exposing the deception of the paper-thin outer walls and severing the secular world with the submarine door. What awaited them was not silence. It was a stripped-down space of madness, where the pure energy of prayer raged with physical mass. V. Blades of primary colour and the cannons of light. As the thick voices of the monks swelled as if to devour the concrete viscera from within, an even more bizarre sight emerged before the dark-adapted eyes of the two. Beside the nave, shrouded in overwhelming darkness, lay the sunken space of the crypt underground altar. There existed no divine twilight of the heavenly realm, such as that brought about by the stained glass of Gothic churches. Instead, from massive cylindrical tubes piercing diagonally through the thick concrete, sealing the cannons of light, canon de lumière, primary coloured light bordering on the violet, pierced straight down toward the floor. The colour of blood, blue and yellow too. Does the light itself possess colour? Schale slowly lowered the hands covering his ears and murmured in a daze. The dove-wing-coloured mohair wool absorbed the vivid red light pouring from the ceiling, instantly dyeing it the colour of a raw, gaping wound. It is the defeat, or rather the destruction method, of stained glass, Edgar announced in a cold yet distinct voice, as he bathed his jet-black vintage cavalry twill coat in the blood-like red. Even amidst the roaring thunder of the hymn shaking the air, his quiet, definitive voice echoed, as if piercing the very core of the space. Instead of letting light pass through, the primary colours of red, blue and yellow were smeared directly onto the inside of the concrete cylinders. The sunlight passing through them dons the physical mass of colour and is fired into this darkness like artillery shells. This is no divine majesty. This is the blade of the guillotine, prepared by the architect to tame natural light with his own hands and cleave the space asunder. The moment Edgar narrowed his jet-black eyes, the monk's hymn reached an exceptionally high, oppressive crescendo. Amen. The violence of the sound waves surpassed their limit, and the logic of the space began to creak audibly. Edgar, the light! The light is bending! Schale let out a voice mixed with terror and fascination. The pillars of primary coloured light, which should have fallen at right angles from the ceiling tubes, began to trace bizarre, pliant arcs. As if pushed by the tremendous sound pressure of the hymn, the red light became like viscous fresh blood, the blue light like a heavy pillar of deep-sea water, and the yellow light like sludgy molten gold. Light, which should possess no mass, physically collided with the praying voices of the monks and began to swirl within the space. 6. The mire of acoustics and the coagulation of light. It is coming, Schale. The heavy mass of prayer is attempting to grant mass to the light. A smile of cruel ecstasy floated at the corner of Edgar's lips. The boundary between sound and light had utterly collapsed. Within the colossal resonance box of concrete, the energy of the hymn, deprived of an escape route, merged with the primary colours fired from the light tubes, turning the space into a sludgy mire. As Schale moved his foot to step back, the red light fallen on the floor clung to his soul like syrup. NGH. My legs are heavy. The sound is entangling itself around my body. You must not move, Schale. Edgar amusedly flicked away droplets of blue light clinging to his jet-black coat with his gloved fingertips. This box is currently undergoing extreme howling. The pure energy of prayer to God has short-circuited the cold geometry drawn by Corbusier from the inside. This is no longer a place where humans can breathe. We are inside a brand new viscera, born from the copulation of sound and light. The pillars of light pouring from the ceiling pulsed, thump, thump, in time with the rhythm of the hymn. Amidst the maddening reverberations where the concrete walls absorbed no sound, but endlessly bounced it back, only the two eternal youths remained anchored like statues, quietly watching the space shed its reason. 7. The ebb of the wave and homogeneous madness. Amen. It was the moment the final note of the hymn crashed against the exposed concrete wall and abruptly dispersed into mist. The primary coloured light that had clung to their feet like a mire suddenly lost its ferocious mass, returning to a mere inorganic projection of the sun. The howling, which had bordered on violence, came to an anticlimactic end, as if a gargantuan beast had fully exhaled its breath. It's gone. The sound and the weight of the light. Schale strongly gripped the chest of his dove-wing-coloured mohair cardigan, collapsing as he took ragged breaths. It seems the acoustic madness set by the maestro does not endure for long. Now, stand up, Schale. Let us proceed deeper into these viscera. Edgar chillily flourished the hem of his jet-black vintage cavalry twill coat and began to walk as if nothing had happened. The two passed through the darkness of the chapel, traversed the undulating corridor, ondulatoire, where narrow glass windows continued in an irregular rhythm, and headed for the upper floors of the monastery, the monks' living quarters cells, a long, endlessly continuing concrete corridor. On one side of it, oppressively heavy wooden doors of terrifyingly exact identical dimensions lined up endlessly in an obsessive repetition. It's unsettling. Every single one is exactly the same door, without a fraction of an inch of difference. It looks less like a place where humans live and more like a specimen box. Precisely. These are groups of individual rooms thoroughly standardized by the modular, the absolute ruler of human bodily proportion scale, established by Corbusier. The sound of Edgar's leather shoes echoed coldly down the dead silent corridor. 1.83 meters in width, 5.92 meters in depth. All the monks are shoved into concrete boxes of exactly the same volume, look at the same light, and pray in the same way. To pare away human individuality to its absolute limit, reducing them to mere components of the modular. This is the true madness known as geometry. As he made that declaration, it was the moment Edgar placed his gloved hand on the doorknob of the first cell. 8. The corridor of fever and the screams of colour. Creak. The door opened with a dry sound. A narrow, ascetic concrete cell, 1.83 meters wide. There was no sign of a living monk within. However, standing in the centre of the room was it. Gah! Schale gasped and clung to Edgar's jet-black back. Towering in the centre of the room was a grotesque mass, the very scream prayer of the monks that had echoed in the chapel earlier, coagulated into a sludgy, physical form, taking the form of an agony that seemed to tear at the vocal cords. The mass was thickly draped in the viscous red light fired from the cannons of light, writhing silently as it vibrated the air. Magnificent. A faint yet clearly feverish sigh escaped Edgar's lips. Without taking his eyes off the mass of the red scream, he slowly backed away and violently threw open the identically sized door right next to it. There, this time cloaked in blue light, a massive voice in the shape of a deeply sinking despair clung to the concrete wall, writhing. Edgar, let's stop. This corridor is abnormal. The anomalies from earlier are all trapped inside these boxes. Schale's voice of restraint did not even reach Edgar's ears now. Edgar, who was always cold and calculating, observing space from a dominant position above, was now throwing open the homogeneous doors one after another, as if stricken by a fever. Yellow jubilation. No, this is a mixture of blue and red, the form of a dark, murky supplication. Bang, bang, the sound of doors being thrown open reverberated through the monastery corridor. Within concrete boxes of exactly the same dimensions, the repressed, unconscious screams of the monks morphed into distinct, multicoloured grotesqueries, searing themselves into Edgar's jet-black eyes. The greatest architectures in history do not end with a single anomaly. These solitary boxes, homogeneously carved up by geometry, have incubated the copulation of sound waves and light from earlier, squeezing them out as their own viscera. Edgar roughly flared his jet-black vintage coat, reaching out as if possessed, with a stumbling gait, to the next door, and the next. Plastered upon his handsome face was a beautiful, yet maddened smile of ecstasy, one that only those who have peered into the abyss of architecture can wear. From the countless open specimen boxes, screams in primary colours of red, blue and yellow spilled silently out into the corridor. Schale simply trembled, his back pressed flat against the cold concrete wall. What he feared were not the masses of primary-coloured screams. It was the very sight of Edgar's unwavering reason being so easily and sensually melted away by the absolute power of this geometry. 9. The melting of the modular and the metamorphosis of pearl. Bang! It was when Edgar violently threw open the dozenth or so door, mesmerised by the dark, murky mass of scream writhing within. Ah! Edgar. From the concrete wall behind him, a terribly sweet and moist voice stroked his eardrums. It was not the voice of Schale, the ennui-laden, translucent 22-year-old youth. It was the heavy, feverish sigh of a female, clinging directly to the mucous membranes deep within the ear. Schale? Edgar slowly turned his feverish, jet-black eyes behind him, and he doubted his own eyes. He watched the hard logic of Corbusier's absolute human scale modular audibly crumble before his very eyes. Schale's body, which had been leaning against the cold concrete wall, was taking on an abnormal heat and melting. Beneath the dove-wing-coloured mohair cardigan, the raw silk chiffon blouse shrieked as if being pushed up from the inside. The thin, wax-white chest of the youth took on a rich swelling in the blink of an eye, stretching the fibres of the thin silk to their limit, revealing a vermilion flush like ripe fruit at their peaks. My body is so hot, Edgar. It feels like my bones are melting. Along with the panting voice, Schale's Adam's apple smoothly vanished. The slender, linear, skeletal structure of his waist transformed into a voluptuous curve, like a tropical snake writhing. The youth's pelvis, having collapsed to his feet, unable to bear the weight of the voluptuous flesh, was being rewritten into the heavy centre of gravity peculiar to a woman. What is this? Has the homogeneous madness of the concrete destroyed even the limits of your physical body? Edgar stood, stunned, the hem of his jet-black vintage coat trembling. In this corridor overflowing with the suppressed primary-coloured screams of the monks, Schale, the eternal, beautiful youth, had absorbed the madness of the space entirely into himself, mutated into the most absurd female form. It was the demonic charm of the Viognier they had drained in Condrieu last night, the suffocating fragrance of white peaches just on the verge of rotting and falling, which began to saturate the barren concrete corridor. Help me, Edgar. Unknown flesh is packed tightly inside me. It's heavy. Schale, his face having completely morphed into that of a woman, trembled his long, tear-soaked, pearl-coloured eyelashes and leaned against Edgar's feet as if crawling on the floor. What peeked through the ultra-thin mohair was no longer the precarious beauty of a youth. It was a perfect, bewitching female body, emitting a terrifying scent of reproduction. Looking down at the voluptuous white arms clinging to his leather shoes Edgar pivoted from mad ecstasy to an unprecedented terror, standing on the precipice of an irresistible temptation. This was the ultimate form of the illusion architecture space grants to humanity. Within the womb of this monastery, the absolute pole of geometry, the eternal youth had been forcibly inverted into the most visceral symbol of maternity and lasciviousness. To be continued in Part 2 of Volume 13. The Phantom Archives of Edgar the Architect and Schale by Gen Kagami. Volume 13. Ava. The Box of Silence. The Guillotine of Light at La Tourette. Part 2. Untethered from the concept of time, the genius architect Edgar and the pearl-haired youth Schale wander through eternity, retaining their youthful, exquisite forms. Across eras, they traverse the world's renowned architectural works and the maddening constructs Edgar himself once assembled. This is a tranquil, decadent journey through phantom architecture, dissecting space, light, gravity, and the anomalies lurking within through cold, unflinching logic. X. The echo of taboo and the indescribable shadow of a sister. The overwhelming weight of flesh collapsed onto the cold concrete floor. From the white, smooth arms of the clinging woman, the fragrance of viognier, like white peaches on the verge of rotting, rose suffocatingly. The fingertips clutching the hem of Edgar's jet-black vintage coat were no longer the bony digits of a youth, but the blood-warmed, terrifyingly voluptuous fingers of a female. Alan. From Edgar's dry lips, the name of his essence, a name that must never be spoken, spilled like a curse. Edgar's cold reason, which had dissected space and subdued all phenomena through purposefulness and mechanics, was now on the verge of total collapse before this voluptuous mass of flesh. The divine ruler established by Corbusier, named the modular absolute dimension, had been snapped by the raw inundation of meat. The defeat of geometry, the death of reason, and Edgar sensed that the presence of the culprit, who had triggered this absurd corporeal metamorphosis, was beginning to thickly saturate this corridor where the monk's primary coloured screams writhed. The shadow of that loathsome sister who had dragged Schale into eternal space-time and forced this cursed journey upon them. Torn between terror, anger, and an irresistible fascination, Edgar looked up at the exposed concrete ceiling, beton brute of the monastery, and within this box of absolute silence, he screamed the taboo word he despised most and had never uttered, as if vomiting blood. God! It was a declaration of total defeat as an architect. However, this cruel resonance box viscera built by the maestro Le Corbusier absolutely refused to allow that anguished cry to reach straight to the heavens. Edgar's scream crashed against the rough concrete walls, reflecting complexly and erratically, copulating with the monk's masses of screams, twisting into hideous sonic waves. G-O-D. G-R-R-A. The reverberation muddied, crumbled, and rebounded from the depths of the corridor has an indescribable dissonance that human vocal cords could never pronounce the true name noise of the loathsome sister named The moment that unpronounceable name vibrated the eardrums, the woman Alan clinging to Edgar's feet gave a violent twitch of her spine. Tear-soaked, long, pearl-coloured eyelashes slowly lifted, and unfocused, wet eyes stared at Edgar. Then, red lips like ripe fruit slowly drew a terribly sensual arc. "You called, Edgar?" "My name." It was neither Schale nor Alan. It was the chillingly beautiful, decadent smile, floated by the will of the sister, waiting at the bottom of the abyss, using the flesh vessel of a woman. The geometry of Laterette completely collapsed, and the dark myth quietly opened its mouth in the concrete locked room. 11. The Chimera of Hellfire and the Birth of Charlotte. Charlotte. Another taboo name slipped from Edgar's mouth, accompanied by a ring of despair and sweetness. Flames. Even while inside a freezing concrete box, the raging fire of that day ruthlessly scorched Edgar's retinas. That madness of losing the sister who shared his blood, and the subsequent moment when even Alan, who could be called his own half, was about to turn to ash within the crimson hellfire. Edgar had made a pact with something, an indescribable contract to tether the two lost souls at the price of eternal time. He had kneaded Alan's scorched flesh and the grudging spirit of his phantom sister with the plaster named Taboo, reconstructing them into a single new vessel. That was Schale, no, a chimera of Alan and his sister Charlotte, the most blasphemous architecture work Edgar had ever undertaken. That's right. Edgar. The woman Charlotte clinging to Edgar's leather shoes, while retaining a faint trace of Alan's visage, whispered with the bewitching smile of his sister. The scent of Viognier's rotting white peaches rode upon her breath, violating Edgar's nostrils. The terrifying geometry of this monastery broke the inorganic exterior wall facade called man that you forced upon me. Look, this is my true skeleton structure that you built within the flames. Charlotte lovingly cradled her own white breasts, which heaved voluptuously beneath the ultra-thin mohair cardigan with both hands. Edgar touched the raw roundness of her shoulder with fingers trembling through his gloves. Hot. An overwhelming thermal pulsation of flesh. As if mocking Corbusier's cold concrete, it scorched his palm with the violent energy of reproduction and maternity. The maddened chimera assembled by the architect Edgar, trespassing into the domain of God. Its seams had melted away in this extreme resonance space of Laterette, and the suppressed body and will of the sister had torn through Alan's consciousness, thrusting themselves to the surface. A complete failure of design. Edgar pulled the body of that woman, the crystallization of his own sins, close to the cold floor, along with his jet-black vintage coat, and spoke quietly, yet definitively. It seems I had shoved the most absurd thing into this beautiful vessel. You are Alan, and you are my loathsome yet beloved. As if to seal Edgar's words, Charlotte's red lips rubbed against his cold cheek. From the countless opened individual room cells, the primary coloured screams of the monks continued to writhe, as if blessing this blasphemous reunion of brother and sister. The monastery meant to confront God had completely sunk to the bottom of memories of hellfire and lasciviousness. Still embracing the monster he had once created within the flames, Edgar merely drowned deeply in the dark fever. 12. The Second Prayer and the Residual Heat of Pearl. It was then, as if dragging the womb of madness up from the deep sea, that mass of thick voices echoed for the second time today. Amen. The resumption of the monk's practice. The moment the gargantuan concrete viscera once again caused a howling bordering on violence, the flesh of the woman in Edgar's arms blurred violently, like footage laced with static. A physical mass of sonic waves struck Edgar's eardrums and brain head-on. His vision flickered, and the heavy weight of the voluptuous flesh he should have been embracing suddenly vanished, as if it had been a lie. Edgar, who had been overusing his reason to the limit, had his consciousness reaped into the bottom of that heavy, dark, acoustic abyss, without time to resist. Edgar. Hey, Edgar. A cold sensation stroked his cheek. When Edgar lifted his heavy eyelids, he was in the dead, silent concrete corridor lined with identical cell doors. The masses of primary-coloured screams, the suffocating scent of white peaches, they were nowhere to be found. Schale. Looking down at Edgar was the ennui-laden, translucently beautiful youth, clad in the dove-wing-coloured mohair cardigan. The chest of the raw silk was flat, and the bony, straight shoulder line proved beyond a doubt that he was a man. I was surprised when you suddenly collapsed. I knew last night's coat roti was too heavy. Did the thin air of this monastery make the drunkenness go to your head? Schale furrowed his pearl-coloured brows in worry, extending a slender arm to help Edgar up. His voice, his gestures, it was the usual Schale. The bug brought about by the geometry of La Tourette seemed to have been completely reset along with that second hymn. Ah, perhaps so. This box seems to have been slightly disagreeable to my reason. Edgar grabbed Schale's arm with his gloved hand and slowly stood up. However, at that moment, Edgar's jet-black eyes caught the area around Schale's eyes at point-blank range, and he faintly gasped. Usually, Schale's pearl-coloured eyes vaguely slipped through the air, but now, deep within the pupils staring back at Edgar, a terribly sensual, viscous heat was scorched, as if clearly remembering the events from moments ago. For a fleeting second, it perfectly overlapped with the gaze of her Charlotte, who had smiled within those flames. Is something wrong? Edgar. Schale tilted his head. By then, the heat deep within his eyes had vanished, returning to the face of an innocent youth. No, it's nothing. Edgar adjusted the collar of his jet-black vintage coat, donning his cold mask once more. Shall we go, Schale? This box of silence is a bit too loquacious for us right now. The sound of their leather shoes began to echo in the cold concrete corridor once again. Without ever looking back at the homogeneous doors lined up behind them, they quietly slipped out of those maddened viscera. End of Part 2, Volume 13. The Phantom Archives of Edgar the Architect and Schale by Gen Kagami. Volume 14. Kobe. The Slumber of Brick and the Labyrinth Awaiting Demolition. Kobe Kitano. Rose Garden. Untethered from the concept of time, the genius architect Edgar and the pearl-haired youth Schale wander through eternity, retaining their youthful, exquisite forms. Across eras, they traverse the world's renowned architectural works and the maddening constructs Edgar himself once assembled. This is a tranquil, decadent journey through phantom architecture, dissecting space, light, gravity, and the anomalies lurking within through cold, unflinching logic. 1. The sea breeze of Hunter Hill and the fever of linen. Kobe, Hunter Hill. A sea breeze, faintly pregnant with the scent of the tide, viscously stroked up the incline that thrust straight toward the slopes of Mount Rocco. The paving stones carpeting their feet were coated in a specialized resin that completely killed the friction of tires, submerging the entire town, clinging to the slope into a bizarre silence and transparent light. The figures of the two youths ascending that soundless incline radiated a terrifying amount of heat and beauty amidst the spring sunlight. What Schale wore directly against his bare skin was an unbleached Irish linen shirt, woven to the absolute limit of coarseness. Whenever the wind blew through, the soft washed linen clung sensually along the lines of his fragile, wax-white collarbones and slender spine. From his widely open chest, sunlight filtered through his pearl-coloured hair slipped down, unabashedly exposing the ennui-laden faint fever, smouldering within the youth, to the sun. Beside him, treading the paving stones of Hunter Hill with a precise rhythm, Edgar's attire was as heavy as if to swallow the light, and chillingly cold. He wore a jacket of supreme silk linen in navy, that profound fabric, emitting the dull lustre peculiar to wild silk tussar, cut and constrained Edgar's maddening rationality, with perfectly exact, unyielding, straight lines. The cold black silk shirt peeking from his collar accentuated his handsome jawline, sharply severing his existence from the soft spring landscape. It is a pleasant wind. There are several concrete buildings along the slope. Even though they have cold stone walls, they somehow strangely blend in with this town. Because they are traces of his training, study in forcing the violent material known as concrete into the crevices of the city. Now, let us turn left here. Ijinkan 2. The beautiful taxidermy and the death of timbercraft. The moment they stepped onto Ijinkan Yamamoto Dori, the landscape vividly changed its aspect. Preserved along both sides of the street were magnificent wooden, weatherboarded Western-style mansions. They're beautiful. It's not that fake, plastic-wrapped kind of rejuvenation like we saw in the old days. They are properly aged, yet terribly beautiful. Indeed. It seems preservation technology has finally caught up with the aesthetics of time. Edgar looked on quietly, without slackening his pace, keeping both hands in the pockets of his silk linen jacket. The wood of the mansions had its progression completely halted at the grey, withering, exposed to the elements, or at the most sweet, exquisite moment, just before the paint cracked. It was an extremely decadent and advanced prescription method that fixed decay at the molecular level, freezing the most beautiful moment in the process of an architecture's deterioration. A beautiful taxidermy. Considering the boorish restorations of the past, this moderate degree of repair borders on the miraculous. However, at the same time, this signifies the total death of the living craft of planing wood and carving joints. Edgar's jet-black eyes chillingly stroked the frozen wooden eaves. With the perfection of a chemical solution that eternally maintains architecture, the physical body of the carpenter has become unnecessary. The craft declines, and no matter where one searches in this country, the hands capable of assembling this mansion from scratch with plane and chisel have likely rotted away and perished. While praising the beauty of the town, he chillingly pronounced the death of the craft lying beneath it. There was no lamentation or sentimentality. Only the physical fact of the transition of structure was spoken of with a flat temperature. 3. Equivalent time and the birth cry of concrete. Eventually, at a corner of Ijinkan, a microcosm where red brick and concrete complexly interlocked revealed its form, the rose garden. That labyrinth, assembled as if clinging to the slope, let countless vines crawl across its steel frame, floating white, tear-like efflorescence on the surface of the bricks as it slumbered quietly. Here it is, Edgar, but there's a demolition notice on the hologram guide board below. It seems it will be destroyed soon. Yes, its economic lifespan has expired. Edgar trailed a gloved finger across the rounded corner of the brick wall. When I first came here, the raw scent of moisture-laden mortar was still rising from this concrete. The designer was a maddened youth who was not yet anyone. He struggled within his blueprints, as if bleeding, trying to pin down the gravity of this slope. Within Edgar's quiet voice was the rough birth cry of its inception. The fact that the designer became a world-renowned maestro and then grew old and turned to ash. At the quiet end of this building, waiting for its demolition before their very eyes. All of these were spoken of as merely a single fact, possessing the exact same temperature and mass. To them, who lived within time, the past, present and future were nothing more than equivalent points lined up on a single axis. Without the nostalgia of old tales or the sorrow for a lost future, Edgar merely looked down upon the entire lifespan of the architecture before him in a single sweeping glance. Come, let us enter, Schale, to drink the final, most beautifully matured cup of coffee before this happy labyrinth returns entirely to an empty lot. Edgar's black leather shoes quietly sounded against the brick stairs, and the two stepped onto the light-drenched terrace. 4. The Tunnel of the Great Buddha and the Sequence of Scenes. The moment they passed through the dark arched entrance and stepped inside the building, Schale let out a small gasp of admiration. Amazing. When I looked from the outside, I thought it was just a heavy, oppressive box. But the inside is like a three-dimensional puzzle box. Letting the wind play with the chest of his Irish linen, Schale bounded up several steps lightly. The strict facade of the exterior was a complete deception. The interior incorporated the steep slopes of Kitano directly into its womb, with intricate differences in elevation forming a complex maze. And, as if sewing together the mesh of those irregular steps, several staircases were bridged at unexpected angles. It is not a mere trick. It is the most vital core method of his design, the sequence of scenes. Edgar stopped midway down the brick passage, his navy silk linen jacket flashing its dull lustre as he looked overhead. His jet-black eyes coldly traced the undersides of the complexly intersecting stairs, as if applying a scalpel. In his later years, he would embed a gargantuan great Buddha into a vast hill in Hokkaido. Worshippers are made to walk through a dark, long concrete tunnel beneath a hill of lavender, and at the very end, they are suddenly confronted with the full view of the light-enveloped Buddha and the void, narrowing the field of vision to the extreme, and then dramatically inverting the space in the next instant. The germination of that violently sudden sequence of scenes is already jostling within this early labyrinth. Within Edgar's quiet voice, both the brick architecture of the designer's youth before him and the gargantuan monument to be built in the northern lands far in the future were dissected as a single technique existing at the exact same coordinates. With every step the walls close in, and upon turning, the sky abruptly opens up. These steps and stairs are a beautiful yet arrogant device to forcibly manipulate the human body and gaze. V. The void of the courtyard and the wedge of disparate materials. A device. Now that you say it, they don't look like mere stairs anymore. Schale slid fingers like white fish along the concrete handrail, turning around gracefully to look down at Edgar. In those pearl-coloured eyes, amidst the ennui-laden fever, dwelt an innocent light, like one solving a spatial puzzle. Look at my position from up there, Schale. Edgar ran his gaze from the passage where he stood to the landing of the stairs Schale had ascended. Between the two lay an atrium-like courtyard void, and the staircase bridged diagonally across it physically connected the two spaces. From the outside, it might have looked like a single building, but in reality, it is divided into two independent zones, the concrete wing and the red brick wing. And that very staircase you are standing on is the wedge that violently pierces through the two zones via the courtyard's void. Edgar's leather shoe struck the brick floor once with a hard sound. The cold, straight lines of concrete and the warm, heavy, earthy mass of brick. Not only are the materials different, but the angles grid at which the buildings are set are also completely skewed. Rather than easily fusing them, he maintains their mutual independence and violence, barely tethering them together as a single architecture, using only the wedge of the diagonally thrust staircase. It is an extremely precarious and sensual joint. The wind blew through, and the Irish linen shirt clung voluptuously to Schale's bare skin. The coldness of the concrete and the dry scent of the sun-baked bricks mingled in the void of the courtyard. Just as Edgar had said, this labyrinth was not merely complex, it was a quiet arena, where disparate materials and angles glared at each other without encroaching on each other's territory. I see. Disparate things are not forcefully mixed together, but merely hold hands through a single staircase. Schale smiled happily, letting out a small chuckle. Precisely. Now, let us climb that wedge to the top, Schale, toward the final heart remaining in the viscera of this dying labyrinth. Beyond Edgar's gaze, from the top floor terrace at the summit of the stairs, the fragrant steam of deeply roasted espresso and a faint jazz melody leaked out. In this architecture where all the tenants had fallen away, leaving a complete void, only the darkness of the wine bar and the terrace of that cafe circulated the final blood of the labyrinth awaiting demolition. Six. The inversion of light and the perfect foam. The moment they finished climbing the dark stairs, the wedge sandwiched between brick and concrete, the vision of the two was pierced by a light bordering on violence. Whoa, it's blinding! Schale shielded his pearl-coloured eyes with the sleeve of his Irish linen. Their vision, which had been narrowed to the limit, was abruptly inverted toward the sky the moment they stepped out onto the top floor terrace. The robust concrete frame completely cut away the superfluous noise of the city, framing only the endlessly clear blue Kobe sky and the dull gleam of the sea surface far below like a massive painting. From the dark tunnel into the sea of light. This is the final act of the space he orchestrated. Edgar's quiet, definitive voice melted into the sea breeze. The two sat in the rattan chairs with the best view, in a corner of the ivy-entwined terrace. The transparent canopy covering overhead sensed the amount of spring UV rays and soundlessly dropped its brightness to a faint polarized blue. Passing through that artificial chilled blue sunlight, upon the table sat the final heart of this dying labyrinth, 2 glasses and a cup brought by the old master of the cafe. At the rim of the pure white porcelain cup, a layer of milk frothed to an exact uniform consistency trembled slightly. The diameter of every bubble was precisely 0.1 millimeters. It was the foam of a cappuccino possessing a lethal perfection, utterly impossible for a human, produced by an automatic extractor that had completely digitized the skills of a master barista. Phew. Schale pursed his lips, thin as petals, and blew softly. His pearl-coloured hair, whipped by the wind, scattered lightly across his forehead, and his washed linen shirt fluttered, tracing the lines of the languid youth's slender collarbones. As he brought his lips to the cup, that mechanically perfect pure white foam clung faintly and voluptuously to his upper lip. Edgar, resting his fingers against the chilled glass of Perrier on the table, observed that sweet scene and the crumbling brick wall behind him with jet-black eyes of the exact same temperature. "Look, Schale!" The concrete walls surrounding this terrace have also been invaded by deep carbonation. The reinforcing steel inside has long since rusted and expanded, beginning to tear its own flesh apart from the inside. The dull lustre of the navy silk linen jacket Edgar wore contrasted sharply with the rough texture of the crumbling wall. But it doesn't feel unpleasant at all, Edgar. The wind passes through, and the way the light enters is incredibly beautiful. Somehow, I feel like I could take a nap here forever. Schale floated an ennui-laden smile, while gently licking the foam from his upper lip with the tip of his tongue. Because the skeleton structure of the space itself has not gone mad. Even if the flesh rots and falls away, the beauty of the lines the architect first drew will remain perfect like this until the final second of its demolition. 7. Wordless tears and the red of morning. Plop. Beside the cappuccino brimming with perfect 0.1mm bubbles, a cold drop of water burst on the rim of the chilled Perrier glass. "Rain?" Schale blinked his pearl-coloured eyelashes and looked up at the sky. However, beyond the auto-polarising blue canopy, only the terrifyingly clear blue sky of Kobe spread out. There was no sign of rain clouds even on the edges of the Rocco Mountains. Plop. Another drop. This time it formed a cold stain on the thin shoulder of Schale's Irish linen. It had not fallen from the sky. It was dripping from the exposed concrete beam covering their heads. "Edgar, it's arrived, hasn't it?" Schale gently wiped the stain on his thin shoulder with a fingertip, narrowing his pearl-coloured eyes in amusement. He too had sensed a terribly quiet and harmless presence, distinct from the madness-filled spaces they had encountered before. This building. It seems it can no longer contain its memory's heat. Edgar removed his fingers from the Perrier glass and looked at Schale with a slight surprise. During their journey through eternal time, this innocent youth had verbalized the subtle emotions of the space, just as he himself would. "Yes, you are correct, Schale." Edgar's quiet, definitive voice fell onto the terrace, mingled with the sound of water. From the cracks in the concrete surrounding the terrace, and from the deep wrinkles running through the joints of the red brick, transparent water was seeping out steadily, as if blood were oozing from veins. The traces of white efflorescence, which had been bone dry until moments ago, took on moisture and melted, turning into countless streaks of cloudy tears that slid silently down the wall surface. It is neither physical condensation nor a plumbing leak. It is an extremely quiet anomaly. It is not crying out of fear of being demolished into an empty lot. It is mourning. Mourning the soul of that insolent designer who bound himself in his youth and struggled against the gravity of this slope. The human body has long since returned to ash, and technology has stolen even death from architecture. But only the skeleton of this space remembers the heat of the lines he first drew and the scent of mortar. Schale gently looked up at the cold concrete wall, as if taking over Edgar's words. It is the silent condolence shed by an architecture that has lost its master and is itself dying. On the terrace, only the faint melody of jazz from afar and the sound of the concrete silently shedding tears echoed. A faint dampness adhered to Schale's translucent white skin and Edgar's handsome cheeks. However, neither of them attempted to wipe away those mysterious tears or search for their cause. As travellers residing in time, they would never perform the boorish act of interfering with this pure sorrow that the space spilled of its own will. Eventually, Edgar quietly set down the glass of Perrier he had not touched and stood up while maintaining his perfect, straight posture. Let us end our coffee here. Yes, it would be churlish for us outsiders to pry into these tears any further. Schale, too, stood up with a flourish of his linen shirt, showing no reluctance to leave the half-remaining cappuccino foam. Where are we going, Edgar? To the bottom of the labyrinth. We head to the other heart remaining in these dying viscera. Edgar quietly stepped his leather shoes toward the tear-drenched brick stairs, the wedge connecting the two spaces. To the designer, and to the end of this noble labyrinth that has accepted its own death. To offer a glass of morning, with a red wine as heavy as blood. Under the spring sunlight, the rose garden continued to weep quietly. The figures of the two beautiful youths melted like phantoms into the depths of the stairs leading to the dark brick womb. End of Volume 14. The Phantom Archives of Edgar the Architect and Schale by Gen Kagami. Volume 15. Barcelona. The Chalk Festival and the Timeless Museum. Part 1. Barcelona Pavilion. 1. The golden walls and the fever of midnight blue. The jet-black surface of the endlessly smooth water basin inhaled the silence of the night, wavering faintly. The statue of the nude woman by Georg Kolber, standing alone upon the water, was stroked by the lukewarm night wind of Barcelona, casting a bewitching silhouette against the green marble wall. An unbelievably thin and light space. It feels as though gravity has completely vanished, Schale murmured languidly, while tilting a baccarat crystal glass. He was swathed in a melting midnight blue silk shirt. Under the dim, indirect lighting, the wax-white nape peeking from his pearl-coloured hair, was struck by the aroma of deeply matured Spanish vintage wine, taking on a faint fever. At his chest, unbuttoned to the very top, the smooth silk fibres allowed the youth's precarious beauty to bleed out into the darkness of the night. Because that is the culmination of the universal space he Mies van der Rohe aimed for. Edgar, immaculately dressed in a bespoke jacket woven from a blend of jet-black summer wool and ultra-fine mohair, stared at the dark red, sinking to the bottom of his glass with cold eyes. His handsome profile, catching the near-magical reflection of light emitted by the golden onyx wall towering behind him, was as cold and beautiful as a statue. Look, Schale, the Roman travertine paving our feet, the alpine green marble partitioning the space, and this golden onyx. There is not a single door to close off a room. Merely planes of walls made from the finest materials are placed, offset without ever intersecting. The walls are nothing more than filters meant simply to flow sightlines and air. He supported the roof with just 8 cross-shaped steel columns, liberating the walls from structure. 2. The feud of maestros and the contradiction of beautiful structure. But somehow is completely different from the concrete of that monastery Corbusier built. That one was much muddier and the air was heavy, Schale said, amusedly watching his own pearl-coloured hair become translucent against the onyx wall. Naturally, they despised each other's philosophies from the bottom of their hearts. However, there is an extremely comical contradiction within this space. Edgar's thin lips drew a chilled arc. supporting the roof with 8 columns and liberating the walls from structure. Though the materials have been replaced with steel and stone, this is the very concept of the Dom-Eno system advocated by Le Corbusier, though Mies himself would have died before admitting it. And then there is that roof. Edgar's gaze turned to the thin, horizontal roof slab. At the time of its creation in 1929, it was a mere facade steel framing smeared with plaster to make it look like a single slab. But decades later, when permanently reconstructing this building, they used reinforced concrete, the muddy material loved by Corbusier, which Mies had sneered at. Ironically, this supreme work of modernist architecture could only attain eternity by relying on the structural concepts and materials of his hated rival. Edgar swirled his glass and quietly drained the red liquid where the dregs of time had settled. Stuttgart, 1927. The Weissenhof Estate Exhibition. I was assembling my own pavilion in the lot right next to theirs. The Swiss fanatic who loved blocks of concrete, and the taciturn German stonemason in pursuit of the absolute beauty of materials. You cannot imagine the supremely comical, beautiful, glaring match when they crossed paths on site. 3. The pure silver paper knife and the news from the south of France. It was the moment Schale let out a soft chuckle and attempted to drain the last sip remaining in his glass. An elderly butler, approaching soundlessly as if gliding across the travertine floor, presented a polished silver tray between the two. Resting upon it was a thick parchment envelope. Without making a single sound, the butler slid a pure silver paper knife to beautifully slice open the heavy wax seal, offering only the letter paper inside to Edgar with reverence. "It seems to be addressed to you, Edgar." Schale blinked his pearl-coloured eyes in wonder. Edgar quietly set down his glass, received the letter paper with his gloved fingertips, and cast a chilling gaze upon it. "Has something troublesome occurred?" "No." Edgar folded the letter paper, a faint but distinct light of exultation dwelling within his jet-black eyes. "The new box I was commissioned to design has, it seems, let out its first cry. It is the notice of completion." Edgar's. "New architecture." Schale's expression instantly brightened with innocent radiance. "Yes, the time for savouring the skeletal remains left by the maestros is over for now. We leave here early tomorrow morning," Edgar announced in a quiet, definitive voice. "Our destination is the south of France, to that museum of clocks I once designed, to entomb time, to that place dominated by a fierce sun and a white bordering on violence." 4. The sea of dawn and the fluidity of steel. 5 in the morning. The cobblestones of Barcelona exhaled the sea mist they had inhaled during the night like cold sighs. What stroked the skin of the two with their backs against the golden onyx of the pavilion was the air of dawn terribly sharp, as if to freeze even the microscopic blood vessels deep within the lungs. The mobile space Edgar had prepared was a jet-black vintage coupe, with a silhouette so low it seemed to crawl along the earth, a streamlined aluminum body carved out by perfect aerodynamics. When the thick door was opened, the beastly scent of Connolly leather matured over the years, and the faintly burnt aroma of high-octane fuel mingled with the cold dawn air, violently assaulting the nostrils. A freezing mahogany steering wheel. Countless analog instruments flickered quietly deep within the dashboard, emitting a faint amber glow. Sinking into the deep bucket seat on the passenger side, Schale let his pearl-coloured hair play in the wind slipping through the gap in the window. The midnight blue silk shirt he wore was as smooth as if the darkness of the night itself had been woven. However, the ultra-fine fibres of silk, which easily rob heat, allowed the sharp air of dawn to pass through without mercy. Goosebumps caused by the cold formed faintly on the wax-white collarbones peeking from his open chest, and the sensual thin silk clung to the youth's fragile skeletal structure as if adhering to it. "It's cold. I didn't know the morning air of Barcelona was sharp as glass," Schale murmured, wrapping his arms around himself through the thin silk. "It is proof that the heat of the Mediterranean has all returned to the sea during the night. But this cold air will end soon." Edgar gripped the mahogany ring precisely with hands clad in thinly tanned peccary driving gloves. His jet-black summer wool jacket had already been discarded in the back seat. What he wore was a pure white Sea Island cotton dress shirt, woven to its absolute limit, his arm, with pale veins running across it, peeking from the cuff carelessly rolled up to the elbow. It drove the shift lever with not a millimetre of error, like the exquisite movement of an antique watch. The heavy clutch engaged, and the 12-cylinder engine let out a beastly roar. Steel pistons repeated their explosions, and that vibration bordering on violence was transmitted directly through the thick chassis to the soles of Edgar's leather shoes and into Schale's spine. The vehicle slipped onto the French autoroute, heading toward the border. Only the dry sound of wide tyres tearing at the asphalt and the wind noise beating against the highly airtight cabin dominated the silence between the two. "Edgar, are the clocks in that place still stopped even now?" Schale asked, his profile illuminated by the amber light of the meters. "It has been quite a long time since I murdered time there." Edgar's gaze pierced beyond the horizon, which had faintly begun to brighten. "As long as the subordinate relationship between the sun and the earth does not change, that moment should be repeating itself there today, without a single second of error. The sole eternity where the path of the sun intersects with the chalk-white walls. But it's still quite a while until the time the light falls on that place. Why did we leave Barcelona so early?" At Schale's innocent question, Edgar's thin lips drew an ever so slightly soft arc. "To stop by the town of Vence. Because you were terribly fond of the roast lamb at the auberge there previously. I intend to take plenty of time for an early lunch and bring you to that chalk-white cage along with the lingering finish of an exquisite wine." "Really? Edgar, that's wonderful." Beyond the windshield, the far end of the horizon began to emit a white luminescence, like heated platinum. The sun of the south of France was finally about to bare its cold eyes. "Shall we go, Schale, to the memory of gastronomy and to the absolute space where light sculpts time?" Edgar quietly depressed the accelerator. Along with a violent gravity G-force that seemed to sew their bodies to the seats, the gargantuan jet-black body of the coupe was sucked into the beyond of the white luminescent asphalt. 5. The water mirror of Thou and the birth cry of violent light. When the jet-black coupe, having continued to run tearing through the darkness, approached the coastal region of the south of France, on the right side of their vision, a plain that looked as though massive mirror plates had been laid out suddenly appeared. Étang de Tout, the vast lagoon lying at the boundary of sea and land, perfectly reflected the sky that had begun to whiten in a flawless calm without a single breath of wind. From the very end of that water's surface, The sun of the south of France finally let out a birth cry bordering on violence. Whoa. Schale shielded his pearl-coloured eyes, narrowed against the glare with his silk cuff. The intense golden light passing through the windshield overran the chilled cabin in an instant. A soft, blood-warmed fever rapidly returned to Schale's wax-white skin, which had been clad in midnight blue silk and goosebumped by the cold dawn air. What overwhelming light intensity! The weight of the air is completely different from Barcelona, Schale gasped, tracing his fingertips along the window glass that had begun to take on heat. Because it is an extreme horizontal plane produced by the material known as water completely submitting to gravity, Edgar, without even wearing sunglasses, chillingly received the intense light that seemed to directly pierce the retinas with his jet-black eyes, his arms gripping the mahogany steering wheel. The pure white Sea Island cotton shirt was so dazzling it seemed to emit light itself, randomly reflecting the morning sun. Look, Schale, the oyster cultivation rafts floating on the lake surface draw a perfect geometric mesh. Humans have drawn equidistant lines upon nature's mirror, and this merciless sun is sharply burning the shadows of those lines onto the water's surface. The 12-cylinder engine let out a low, smooth growl as it slipped past the lakeside. The box I will guide you to next is the same as this. It is a trap that has thoroughly calculated this violent light of the south of France, completely capturing time, using only pure white walls and the angles of the shadows that fall upon them. The vast water mirror of Thau flew away behind them, and the car turned its nose toward the hilly terrain characteristic of the south of France, where white dry limestone and low pine forests continued. Eventually, as the sun raised its altitude further toward the zenith, and the world began to be dominated by a white that seemed to have stripped away all colours. Atop a desolate hill, that bizarre mass of geometry revealed its form, a block of pure white concrete devoid of any ornamentation that seemed to sharply cleave even the blueness of the sky. We have arrived, Schale, the chalk-white museum where I murdered time. Edgar turned the steering wheel, and the jet-black coupe quietly ceased its beast-like breathing upon the paving stones of the pure white approach. To be continued in Part 2 of Volume 15. The Phantom Archives of Edgar the Architect and Schale by Jen Kagami. Volume 15, Vence. The Chalk Festival and the Timeless Museum, Part 2. Couturier Family Clock Museum. Synopsis of Part 1. Slipping through the faintly feverish night of Barcelona, Edgar and Schale headed for the south of France in a jet-black coupe. Following a 660-kilometre sprint and an elegant lunch in Vence, the two arrive at a bizarre mass of geometry towering beneath the violent sun. The chalk-white museum to murder time, designed by Edgar himself. 6. The titanium phantom and the jet-black nest. The desolate summit of a hill in the south of France, beyond the approach where the jet-black coupe had stopped, Schale narrowed his pearl-coloured eyes against the glare, looking up at the gargantuan mass through the windshield. Amazing. When I looked from afar, I thought it was a pure white concrete cube because of the intense reflection. It is not white, Schale. That is a body of bare titanium, not even subjected to paint. Edgar pushed open the thick car door and alighted into the violent light of the south. Schale too stepped out of the coupe, letting his midnight blue silk flutter in the wind. A heated, dry breeze roughly tossed their hair. Towering before their eyes was a gargantuan, perfect cube, measuring 25 meters on each side, easily comparable to a 5-story building. However, the intimidation one ought to feel from its mass was bizarrely sparse. What covered the entire first layer of the exterior wall was uniform, punched titanium metal. Perfect circular holes, 20 millimeters in diameter, were pierced in a flawless staggered arrangement at a 45 millimeter pitch. The intense southern sun passing through the countless holes generated a fine moire interference fringe upon the metal surface, warping this gargantuan 25-meter box semi-transparently, as if it were a heat haze. It makes me dizzy. Even though it's a metal wall, it's see-through, and the structure deep inside looks like it's layered double or triple. Schale took a step forward, as if being sucked into the titanium phantom. Seen from the outside, it is merely a uniform 25-meter box. But the internal structure is biased completely asymmetrically. Edgar let the sleeves of his white Sea Island cotton be whipped by the wind, as he dissected the logic of the space he himself had assembled with a chilling voice. 2 meters inward from this titanium membrane, only on the north and east faces does a 23-meter square glass cube, which forms the second layer, sink in. And inside that glass lies the 5-meter wide margin of the foyer. Sitting enthroned in the center, beyond that, is an 18-meter square jet black cube, which serves as the exhibition space. It's a nested structure, like a matryoshka doll, but if there are only gaps on the north and east... Exactly. On the west and south faces, neither the 2-meter gap nor the 5-meter foyer exists. Titanium, glass, and the jet black wall. These 3 layers are perfectly and seamlessly adhered to each other on the outer perimeter. Edgar's jet-black eyes sharply fixed upon the southwest edge of the cube, as if piercing through both the titanium punched metal and the jet-black wall deep behind it. A single, gargantuan, sharp slit was carved there. Why create such an extreme bias? In order to thrust this violent sunlight as a blade of 100% purity into the jet-black core. Inside, lined up, are hundreds of mechanical clocks that have been wound for the selfish convenience of humans, forced to mark uneven time. An arrogant, terribly beautiful smile floated upon Edgar's thin lips. Therefore, I shall teach them, by displaying the trajectory of the universe's absolute rotation light shining through that slit in the southwest, showing those machines their true own time. 7. The viscera of darkness and the released second hands. Come, let us enter to the room of the beautiful dead, stripped of time. The heavy door, assimilated with the jet-black wall, was open. The moment the two stepped into its womb, the thick door behind them closed completely, with a ponderous driving sound. Edgar, the door, 2:40 p.m. This jet-black exhibition room core is now entirely isolated from the outside world. Within the 18-meter square of total darkness cube, there thousands of antique mechanical clocks were lined up in orderly fashion. However, not a single one of them was moving. Rusted pocket watches, hall clocks with chipped dials. The hams of every clock were fixed at the angle of 1446, submerged in a complete, deathly silence. Eventually, the faint artificial lighting installed in the ceiling began to slowly, yet certainly, drop its illuminance the moment 2:43 p.m. arrived. It's gradually getting darker, because this gargantuan 18-meter black box is a dark room built solely for these 3 minutes. To purify the light that is about to visit to the utmost limit. And then 2:46 p.m. Immediately after the space had sunk into absolute darkness without a single ray of light, the altitude of the intense sun having passed the zenith of the south and begun to tilt, perfectly matched the angle of the slit bored diagonally through the thick wall. A flash. A single blade of light of 100% purity pierced diagonally through the jet-black space. That cosmic trajectory, possessing a specific angle of incidence, mercilessly and beautifully sniped only the countless clocks silent at the bottom of the 20. Darkness, the machines that had eternally stopped their hands at 14:46, like a spotlight. No matter how many times one adjusts a maddened second hand, it is nothing more than a transient measure created by man. Edgar stood right beside the blade of light, dyeing his pure white cuffs in its brilliance, as he declared in a quiet, definitive voice. But the angle of incidence of this light is different. This box teaches them who cannot move. For this moment alone, your time is in perfect synchrony with the universe. You are the absolute correct answer. Schale gazed at the dead clocks, shining beautifully as they were pierced by the light of a specific angle, and gasped. However, the Earth does not stop its rotation. The perfect moment of 14:46 passed, and as the sun's angle shifted ever so slightly, the blade of light that had sniped the clocks melted into the darkness like a phantom and vanished. Once again, complete darkness visited it. Was then. It is coming, Schale. It seems the machines can no longer suppress the heavy pressure of the absolute correct answer light, Edgar quietly announced, narrowing his jet-black eyes in the darkness. Tick, tick, clack, click, ring, bong, bong, bong. Eh? Schale tightly gripped the chest of his midnight blue shirt. From the bottom of the darkness, which should have been complete silence, a maddened flood of sound welled up. The machines that should have been eternally dead were beginning to beat all at once. However, it was not the sound of regular second hands. Gears spinning like they were fast-forwarding, hands rotating in reverse, bells ringing at random. Thousands of clocks were thrashing about, as if ravenously consuming their own time, unbound by anyone. It is neither an anomaly of the mainsprings, nor a madness of gravity. It is an extremely noisy anomaly, Edgar's quiet, clear voice echoed, weaving through the gaps of countless mechanical sounds. They are not merely broken and running out of control. They are rejoicing. Rejoicing that they have been liberated from the correct answer rules of the universe and can mark their own free time. It's a trackless hymn of life, played by machines that have lost their masters and been forced into eternal death. Schale smiled, looking out over the sea of frantic sound as if taking over Edgar's words. Yes, you are correct, Schale. Edgar's quiet, definitive affirmation fell to the bottom of the noisy darkness. Eventually, 2:49 p.m. Along with a faint driving sound, the ceiling lighting slowly began to regain its brightness, and the heavy door behind them was thrown open. The moment the light from the foyer poured in, abruptly, the thousands of frantic sounds ceased, as if they had been a lie. The clocks lined up orderly under the lights regained their complete silence once more, and all their hands were coldly fixed, pointing to 1446, as if nothing had happened. It's over. It was their own free journey of a mere 3 minutes. Schale exhaled a faintly trembling breath, staring at one of the pocket watches that had gone cold. Somehow I'm envious. Envious? Because we must continue to walk through this stagnant time for eternity. How beautiful it must be to be given a perfect, correct answer at a certain point like them, and then be able to freely go mad like this from time to time. In Schale's pearl-coloured eyes, an ennui-laden resignation and a terribly pure thirst wavered. Edgar said nothing, merely touching Schale's slender shoulder with fingertips clad in a thin glove. To us, who wander eternity, this perfect stasis and liberation of theirs is a terribly cruel, sweet dream. The 18-metre cube that had regained its silence once more. The two travellers, unbound by time, stood frozen before the clocks, which would continue to sleep eternally until the next cosmic trajectory visited, simply continuing to gaze at their quiet, dead faces in silence. 8. The memory of Vonce's light and the seat of the wind. Monsieur Edgar, you were inside your own work after all. Suddenly, beyond the open heavy door, from the brightness of the foyer, an elderly gentleman approached. This man, impeccably dressed in a tailored linen suit, was none other than Monsieur Couturier, who had commissioned Edgar to design this box. Ah, it was not a bad floral tribute light. Edgar quietly turned back, carelessly flourishing the sleeves of his pure white sea island cotton. Truly, I do not know how to express my gratitude. Monsieur Couturier bowed deeply, looking up dazzlingly at the polka dots of light spilling from the titanium holes. When I saw the first blueprints, I thought it was madness. A gargantuan black box solely for creating 3 minutes of darkness within a block of titanium devoid of a single window. I pleaded with you countless times to please make it an ordinary, beautifully bright museum, but you swallowed my design. Yes, as a result, your design brought about a miracle. The experiential space brought by those 3 minutes of darkness and a single beam of light is now receiving immense praise from architectural critics around the world. Would you please allow me to submit this to an International Architecture Award this year? Of course, I will ensure your remuneration is substantial. Edgar, with terribly cold indifference and a touch of annoyance, silenced Monsieur Couturier's heated words with fingertips clad in thin gloves. Worthless. I have no interest in awards and the like. Edgar's jet-black eyes stared at him quietly as ice. It is not the mediocre judges of the era who determine the true value of architecture. It is only gravity and time. Besides, I merely placed a box suitable for this slope, just as your great-grandfather's will dictated. I require neither remuneration nor honour. My great-grandfather's. Yes. The will only stated, find an architect named Edgar who designed the chapel next door. Only that man can manipulate true light. Monsieur Couturier tilted his head in wonder. In my great-grandfather's time, when that chapel was built, it was over 70 years ago. A genius architect who thoroughly calculated the light of the stained glass and the white tiles alongside the maestro Matisse. And furthermore, he forgave Matisse even when Matisse boasted that he had designed it himself. I commissioned you because the name was the same, but no matter how I look at it, you still appear to be a youth in his 20s. Was it your grandfather that my great-grandfather was looking for? Modern humans had no way of knowing the true nature of youths residing in time. Edgar neither denied nor affirmed, merely drawing a terribly arrogant arc upon his thin lips. Who knows? However, slicing up the strong south of France sunlight with blue and yellow glass in the past was not a bad way to kill time. Because his Matisse's sense of colour was quite good. Edgar has always preferred delicious wine and interesting structures toys over certificates. Schale offered an ennui-laden smile and a small wink. Well then, we shall be taking our leave. Take good care of those clocks. Leaving Monsieur Couturier standing there with his mysteries, the two quietly departed the chalk-white labyrinth. Upon emerging outside, the violent sun of the south had already tilted to the west, dyeing the titanium exterior walls in a pale amber hue. The jet-black vintage coupe parked on the desolate hill. When Edgar climbed into the driver's seat, he unlatched the streamlined roof and retracted the heavy top backward using the manual mechanism. You even hid the mechanism trick to turn it into a convertible. Schale, having slipped into the passenger seat, narrowed his eyes, looking up at the vast evening sky of the south spreading overhead. After exiting sealed, dark viscera, one desires air, does one not? When Edgar twisted the key, the 12-cylinder engine once again let out a beast-like roar, vibrating the chassis. Depressing the accelerator, the jet-black coupe began to slide toward the evening coastline. Into the cabin that had lost its roof, the sweet, chilling Mediterranean wind of evening rushed in forcefully. Schale's midnight blue silk shirt fluttered wildly, and his pearl-coloured hair was beautifully dishevelled, catching the light of the setting sun. The wind. Feels good, Edgar. Indeed, for we have left the heavy pressure of absolute time rules behind in that jet-black box. Edgar, letting his pure white sleeves be whipped by the wind, stared straight ahead without loosening his grip on the steering wheel. Let us drive for a while longer, within an ambiguous time that never stops. For now, feeling this wind instead of the hands of a clock. The autoroute along the sea dyed in orange, the jet-black coupe carrying the two travellers unbound by time, left only the lingering resonance of its beautiful engine sound in the air of the south, melting vividly into the beyond of the dusk. End of Volume 15. The Phantom Archives of Edgar the Architect and Schale by Gen Kagami. Volume 17. Shanghai. The Labyrinth of Filtered Flesh and Blood. 1933. Old Mill Fun. 1. Golden crab roe noodles and the lukewarm wind of the Demon City. Hey Edgar, these crab noodles are a gorgeous golden colour, but the scent is so thick it makes me dizzy, heavy like mud, clinging stickily to the tongue. In a back alley off the Bund in Shanghai, dominated solely by the suffocating violent aroma of crab, with no room for any other spices, Schale languidly moved his ivory chopsticks, letting his pearl-coloured hair catch the murky twilight. Inside the white porcelain bowl, the sticky white robayao and viscera of male crabs raised in Suzhou's Yangcheng Lake in November had been thoroughly scraped out and boiled down in hot pork fat. This crab roe chiffon had become a golden swamp, completely suffocating the thin noodles. Naturally, it eliminates all noise such as petty tricks and fills the bowl solely with the bare core of life. It is a crystallization meant to dismantle countless lives and slurp up only the densest vitality. Edgar quietly downed a small cup of 15-year-old Shaoxing wine, discoloured to a dark, blood-like hue by the passage of time. His fingertips, cold and white as porcelain, maintained an arrogant cleanliness, utterly repelling the surrounding clamour and the smell of oil. I hear an incongruous cluster of high-rise apartments lines the shores of Yangcheng Lake, but the thought of this golden mud squirming and growing at the feet of that inorganic concrete is a not unpleasant contrast, quite fitting for this country. Are you solving someone's problem in a way only you can, at a higher dimension of beauty or rationality? This chef solved the problem of extracting only the climax of taste from the crab through thorough dismantling and filtration, a ruthlessly rational method. Having delivered his chilling pronouncement, Edgar brushed up his damp black hair and rose from his seat, his charcoal grey cashmere coat sliced through the air, churned by the shop's rusty electric fan. Schale, too, innocently wiped the golden fat remaining on his lips with a fingertip and followed, letting the hem of his ivory knit flutter. It was undyed cashmere, combed in the extreme cold of Inner Mongolia. Seamless, it was an exquisite membrane that merely draped silently along Schale's fragile skeletal structure, without defying gravity. Stepping out of the shop, the lukewarm wind peculiar to Shanghai, pregnant with the scent of the Huangpu river's mud, clung stickily to their cheeks while blurring the city's neon lights. The asphalt shone black with mysterious puddles, in which primary-coloured signboards wavered toxically. A disgusting wind. The air is so heavy, it feels like I'll get wet right through my clothes. Schale furrowed his brow at the clinging discomfort and languidly tugged at the collar of his knit. Because the humidity of Shanghai ambiguously rots all contours. However, where we are heading now is a ruthless concrete organ that perfectly borders only the contours of death. Edgar turned up his coat collar against the damp night wind and fixed his gaze on the darkness of the Hongkou district. Beyond the intertwining power lines and old apartment blocks, that alien structure crouched like the carcass of a gargantuan beast. Countless geometrically hollowed-out windows and complexly intersecting aerial corridors. It was once the largest slaughterhouse in the Orient, a perfect labyrinth designed solely to efficiently guide cattle to their deaths without inciting panic. Hey, what is that? Rather than a building, it looks like a giant maze of bones. Schale stopped, captivated by its concrete majesty. 1933. Old Mill Farm. Designed by the British architect Balfours, Edgar stated flatly. It is the same as the crab roe noodles from earlier. The intricately winding cattle paths ere bridges, the rough floors meant to drain blood. All of it is a design, optimized solely to dismantle life and extract the components known as meat. Come, Schale. A visual inspection of the circulation of death is required. 2. Pure white pathology and the mushroom skeleton. The exterior was disarmingly flat, geometric Art Deco concrete. However, the moment Schale passed through the heavy entrance and stepped into the atrium space, sandwiched between the cylindrical central building and the square outer building, he gasped at an overwhelming gravity akin to vertigo. It's completely different from the outside. It's like being suddenly thrown right into the middle of a living creature's internal organs. Schale's pearl-coloured hair swayed in the cold wind blowing through the bottom of the complexly intertwined labyrinth. Supporting the space were countless gargantuan umbrella columns that flared polygonally toward the top. It was a robust mushroom skeleton meant to support the mass of hundreds of capel, and upon the exposed concrete surface, the marks of the wooden formwork plywood were etched vividly, like wrinkles on skin, concealing the internal madness with a flat epidermis. A magnificent method. Edgar quietly scraped the rough concrete floor with the sole of his smooth leather shoe. But the pathology harboured by modern renovations is far deeper and spreads more hideously. Open that door, Schale. Where Edgar gestured with his chin, there was a heavy steel door painted an unnaturally bright white, as if embedded in a grey concrete wall, stained with the memory of mud and blood. Whoa, it's so white, it's blinding. What lay beyond the cold handle Schale languidly pulled open was an inorganic, perfectly refined, pure white restroom. The latest ceramics, seamless white walls, and a homogeneous light that cast no shadows. The white painted on the thick steel door was a violent prelude, hinting at the morbid cleanroom within. Separated by a single door, the dimension was completely severed from the dim labyrinth of slaughter outside. It is a pathology called a clean room, meant to completely purge the most raw, biological human act of excretion from the context of this blood-stained concrete. Edgar did not even attempt to step into that pure white space, twisting his lips chillingly. They could not bear the mixing of the cattle's memories of death with the stench of their own lives. Therefore, they thoroughly bleached the tragic terroir of the past, with these pure white tiles and ceramics, glossing it over as if it were a safe, cultured space. Those frameless, transparent glass handrails and the beautiful offices are the same. This cleanliness bordering on violence is precisely the true identity of the arrogant deception noise, wherein they avert their eyes from the memories of the past. 3. The spiral to the sun and the cosmic slaughterhouse. Now we go off. We shall trace the circulation of death they walked. The two stepped onto the cattle paths, air bridges that connected the central building and the outer perimeter, crossing complexly like a spider's web. They slowly began to ascend the concrete ramps, their surfaces deeply scored with anti-slip grooves in a spiral motion. It's strange. The higher we climb, the stronger the sunlight shining in from outside becomes. It's very peaceful and beautiful. Schale narrowed his eyes at the afternoon sunlight streaming through the geometric window frames, softly holding the sleeve of his ivory knit up to the light. But Edgar's profile was stiff and cold as a sculpture. To a human, it would be an ascent toward the light. But for the cattle forced to walk here, it was different. As the sunlight grew closer, the air thinned, and the smell of blood thickened. To them, approaching the light was synonymous with approaching absolute death. At those cold words, Schale shuddered. The brighter it becomes, the closer death approaches. Climbing the ramp, fraught with that maddening paradox, the two finally reach the top floor of the central building, the centre of the former slaughter space. What is this place? It's supposed to be a slaughterhouse, but somehow it's like outer space, Schale murmured blankly. Overhead in the vast circular space, a ceiling of orderly metal louver slats, retrofitted during the renovation, was stretched across. The thin strips of light and shadow pouring down from it drew cold geometric patterns on the concrete floor. There was no rawness of blood or flesh anywhere. It was governed solely by a deathly, absolute silence that was inorganic, anti-gravitational, and defied comprehension. A contradiction. The eyes peeking through the gaps in Edgar's black hair gleamed sharply as ice. They abstracted this place, steeped in the scent of blood and flesh, to the extreme with metal and glass, and even went so far as to dress it up as a refined universe. However, the more they gloss it over, the more the concealed memories of the concrete in reaction begin to starve more vividly and violently. The contradiction of the space has surpassed its breaking point. Suddenly, the metal louver ceiling, which had been dead silent like the interior of a spaceship, began to creak with a faint yet grating metallic sound. Schale, it comes. The architecture has begun to dream of us. 4. Transparent fangs and the louver universe. The orderly strips of light and shadow abruptly flashed violently like a maddened metronome, robbing the entire space of its sense of equilibrium. Kya! Schale let out a short scream. The refined, frameless, transparent glass handrails that had bordered the cattle paths and corridors they had climbed up suddenly ran with countless sharp cracks all at once, accompanied by a high-pitched shatter. But the glass did not scatter. The cracked transparent panes, like gargantuan transparent fangs, possessing a will of their own, warped sharply backward and lunged towards Schale as he walked the corridor. "Look out!" Immediately after Edgar strongly pulled Schale's arm toward him, a transparent fang soundlessly grazed the sleeve of Schale's ivory knit, slicing the soft cashmere fibres in a straight line. "Hick," the glasses, like a living creature, Schale murmured in a trembling voice. The soft lighting of the refined offices was swallowed by the flickering shadows of the louvers, completely vanishing. This is not something ambiguous like a grudge or a curse. It is a runaway function, honed to its absolute limit. Edgar chillingly kicked and shattered the approaching transparent fang with his charcoal grey leather shoe. A dry sound like beautiful ice cracking echoed. Snap! But the shards immediately rose again as new fangs. Even after losing the lives targets it was meant to dismantle, this old Milfen simply continued to spin its perfect logic of filtration in a vacuum, and over that, the flimsy glass and metal noise of the modern era, attempting to forcibly gloss them over into a safe and cultured space, placed a lid. Edgar looked up at the flickering louver ceiling. In his cold eyes, those geometric patterns evoking the universe now looked like the blades of a gargantuan meat grinder. Look, the concealed and suppressed cruel purpose logic of the past is rewriting the refined materials of the modern era themselves into murder weapons. In order to regain its original function of dismantling life, it is attempting to carve us Progaro masses of life, using the most harmless-looking glass and louvers. Schale, sheltered behind Edgar's back, exhaled a trembling breath. Unrefined grey concrete and refined glass metal writhing madly. Two conflicting eras were demonstrating a terrifying harmony for the single, maddening purpose of efficiently dismantling life. It's beautiful, but I don't want to be here anymore. I feel like my own body will be carved into parts for this inorganic universe. 5. The heavy bass whistle and the mud of the demon city. The exact moment the countless approaching transparent fangs attempted to lick the edge of Edgar's leather shoe. Boom! A heavy bass sound that seemed to shake the very bottom of the stomach abruptly and violently severed the madness of the perfect dismantling machine. It was the whistle of a gargantuan cargo ship crawling along the Huangpu River, pushing through the muddy water, carrying vast amounts of goods and human desires. That overwhelming vibration of life invaded through the narrow ventilation slits, meant to let the smell of cattle blood escape, causing the metal louvers and transparent glass, which had been putting on airs of a zero-gravity universe, to resonate ungracefully. The vibration of mud and water veins, a mass of reality, far too heavy and raw, slammed into a closed, inorganic logic. Edgar dropped a chilling glance at the trembling glass shards one last time. In that instant, unable to withstand the overwhelming external context, the transparent fangs filling the labyrinth soundlessly returned to their original, frameless handrails, as if the power to a magic lantern had been cut, and the flickering of the louvers also ceased completely. "Ha! Ha!" Schale gasped heavily, as if collapsing on the spot. The cold logic of dismantling that had tried to invade the depths of his lungs was rapidly peeling away, along with the damp wind of the Huangpu River. This is now merely a gargantuan white elephant monument, having lost its purpose of dismantling life, yet continuing to eternally gloss over its form alone. It is a pitiful skeleton of concrete. The two descended the cattle path, which had regained its silence once more, and exited the heavy entrance into the Shanghai night. The moment they stepped outside, the lukewarm wind of the demon city mingled with mud and exhaust fumes violently slapped their cheeks. From the direction of the Huangpu River, that heavy bass sound still echoed faintly, and the surrounding alleys overflowed with clamour, as if that deathly universe, purified and glossed over to the extreme just moments ago, had been a lie. This was a sinkhole of overwhelming life, where countless lives writhed chaotically together. Somehow I suddenly feel nostalgic for that golden crab mud from earlier. Schale languidly brushed away the pearl-coloured hair, sticking to his nape with fingertips that were still trembling slightly. A bloodless, glasswork-like whiteness remained on his cheeks. The skin peeking from the torn sleeve of his knit looked terribly cold. That, too, is the violence of dismantling and extraction. However, at least over there, the vulgar human desire noise to taste remains. It is far healthier than the universe of a clean room. Edgar, without looking back at the 1933 old mill fun crouching like the carcass of a gargantuan beast, began to walk toward the sea of neon lights with an unwavering stride. There is nothing more terrifying and more hideous than a perfect function whose purpose has been concealed. Let us go, Schale. There is no need to linger. Schale looked back at that gargantuan concrete labyrinth just one last time, gave a small shudder as if enduring something, and then followed Edgar's back. Avoiding the puddles where primary-coloured signboards wavered toxically, the two melted into the chaotic Shanghai night. End of Volume 17. The Phantom Archives of Edgar the Architect and Schale by Jen Kagami. Volume 18. Turku. The alternation of perspective and the Nordic cloudiness. Salmon dill distortion. 1. Golden salmon and the anesthesia of the far north. Hey Edgar, this soup has such a comforting taste. The scent of the dill and the rawness of the salmon go so well together. In the freezing winter of Turku, Finland, at the old brick-built Tinto standing along the Aura River, at a window seat covered in thick frost, Schale let out an ennui-laden sigh. His pearl-coloured hair, clinging to his nape, inhaled the dull, leaden winter light and became bewitchingly translucent. Within the deep white porcelain dish, lohikeitto, salmon soup, made by boiling down fatty salmon, caught in the far northern sea, and root vegetables in a violent amount of heavy cream, radiated a golden heat. However, its surface was completely covered with a massive amount of green dill, as if to thoroughly conceal the fishiness. This soup is not merely for tasting. It is also an anesthesia, known as thermal mass, to escape the far northern reality of freezing to death. It is a harsh land. Edgar quietly tilted a glass of aquavit, chilled like ice, with translucent wax-white fingertips. His profile was cruel, as if carved directly from a freezing glacier, harbouring the contours of perfect geometry that permitted no flaws. Before the coldness noise that brings one face to face with death, the delicate flavours of ingredients are meaningless. This chef resolved the reality of extreme cold through the most rational method, completely painting it over with the scent of violent fat and herbs. A magnificent design. Purposefulness to conceal the raw presence of death. Having delivered his chilling pronouncement, Edgar donned a heavy jet-black ulster coat, tailored as if by cutting the darkness itself, and stood up. Schale, too, innocently wiped the golden cream remaining on the edge of his lips, faintly reddened by the extreme cold of the north, with a fingertip, and rose from his seat. Enveloping his fragile limbs was a heavy, snow-white, low-gauge sweater, thick as if woven with silver threads. The smooth nape, like porcelain that knew no sunlight, peeking through the rough, loose mesh, highlighted a cruelly fragile, ephemeral silhouette. Stepping out of the restaurant, the freezing wind from the Baltic Sea, sharp as a blade, mercilessly robbed the two of their body heat. From the grey sky, powder snow danced down soundlessly. It's so cold, it hurts. Even wearing clothes, it feels like my skin is going to freeze and crack. Schale trembled his long eyelashes against the piercing cold, shrinking his body as if to cover half his face with his snow-white cuff. Deep within those eyes, an absolute scar that Edgar must never touch, precipitated faintly, like bubbles at the bottom of ice. The winter in this country mercilessly pares away the contours of life. That is precisely why the place we are heading to now is filled with a sweet, dangerous anesthesia meant to avert one's eyes from the reality of death. Edgar turned up his coat collar against the freezing wind and fixed his gaze on the deep pine forest in the outskirts of Turku. Deep in the snow-covered silent forest, the structure crouched quietly as if mimicking a part of nature itself. The Resurrection Chapel in Turku, designed by Eric Brigman. It is the same as the soup from earlier. As a result of thoroughly attempting to cover up the rawness of death with the herb known as the forest, it discarded the absolute, singular God and snuggled up to the spirits of the forest. Animism, a space of heresy. Come, Schale. A visual inspection of a pathological architecture that has lost its discipline is required. 2. The asymmetrical altar and the forest of heresy. Passing through the heavy bronze doors, the moment they stepped into the nave, Schale stopped at a strange sense of incongruity. It's weird. Even though it's a chapel, it doesn't feel sacred at all. In fact, my gaze is being pulled to the window on the right on its own. Exactly as Schale said, the space had completely destroyed the absolute rules of religious architecture. While the left side facing the altar was coldly closed off by an inorganic, robust wall, the right side was opened up, almost defenselessly, toward the snow-covered pine forest by a continuous series of gargantuan glass windows. Naturally, for this is not a place to offer prayers to God. Dragging his jet-black cloak, Edgar quietly scraped the dead-silent stone floor with his smooth leather shoes. His chilling gaze was directed at the altar and cross, shoved crampedly into the deepest part of the space. Originally, a chapel must be an absolute centripetal space for confronting God, the transcendent. However, Brigman, of all things, intentionally shifted the axis of the space, not toward God, the altar, but toward nature, the forest on the right. He is forcibly guiding the gaze of the bereaved families not to the eternal God, but to the shifting light and plants. Does that mean he prioritized the scenery of the forest over God? Schale softly extended his pearl-coloured fingertips toward the black pine branches swaying beyond the glass. His arm extending from the sleeve of his snow-white sweater was as thin and translucent as glasswork. Yes, from the perspective of an orthodox theologian, this is a spine-chillingly pantheistic, animistic approach, a space of heresy that denies the foundation of Christianity. However, to scatter the heavy pressure of the bereaved sorrow like anesthesia, the presence of the forest swaying in the light functioned far better than the strict teachings of God. Edgar twisted his lips chillily, as if looking down upon the altar. The essence of design is always purposefulness, Schale. He did not betray God. For the problem-solving of efficiently peeling the living away from the sorrow of death, he judged that nature was more usable than God, and merely discarded him rationally. However, the price of bringing in an unknown bug known as 8 million spirits, even at the cost of destroying the discipline of the space, is by no means cheap. This space, having lost its sole absolute sovereign, is now unable to withstand the erosion of the forest and is causing a fatal contradiction. 3. The false halo and the freezing golden thorns. But Edgar, look at that lighting. It looks somewhat warm. Schale pointed at the high vaulted ceiling with glasswork-like fingertips peeking from the sleeve of his snow-white sweater, a cluster of golden brass lights floating in the mid-air of the asymmetrical space. Those lights, possessing organic curves mimicking plant vines and leaves, radiated a faint heat in the chilled stone space, like soft patches of sunlight, or a halo floating above a saint's head. False sons. Brigman, who drove the sole and absolute God into the corner of the space, required a substitute to fill that void and scatter the sorrow of the bereaved. Therefore he suspended that indigenous golden light, mimicking sunlight filtering through the forest trees in mid-air. Edgar, enveloped in his jet-black cloak, looked up at the lighting with a cruel gaze, as if viewing a mere functional device. It is not the stern light pouring down from the heavenly God that a true church possesses. This is an extremely functional, sickly sweet deception noise, designed solely to nestle close to human sentimentality and soften sorrow like anesthesia. However, having lost the absolute discipline of a single God and snuggled up to the presence of the 8 million in the forest, this space can no longer maintain its own contours. The moment Edgar muttered low, the black pine forest beyond the windows began an eerie quickening. The ivy crawling within the hall withered black and fell, and the golden lights blinked madly, accompanied by a grating sound of electrical discharge. "Watch your step, Schale." The gold of God, peeling from the creaking glass, possesses a cruelty that surpasses the blades of this world. It will easily rend that white porcelain skin of yours. Schale, it comes. Upon the glass membrane, a fanatical reconquista is squirming. The sole God, whose throne was usurped by the forest, lets his cruel authority crawl to paint over the windows with golden icons. Opposing this, the 8 million spirits cause the freezing pine forest to bloom madly, beginning to squirm to reclaim that transmission through the colours of life. Mies van der Rohe said God is in the details. But here, those very details are the front lines of a hideous territorial dispute. The jet-black ulster coat flourished, shielding the faintly trembling pearl-coloured hair behind his back. The freezing starboard glass surface. There, the cruel gold of Byzantium was already crawling up like frost, sealing the freezing landscape into blindness. However, the forest on the outer rim would not permit this. Forcibly dragging out a frenzied spring, it slammed blood-red petals and toxically vivid autumn leaves against the reverse side of the transmission, hideously adhering to the golden authority and raising a creak. It looks like primary-coloured vomit. The smell of heated gold leaf and rotting flowers is mixing, and my vision is murky. Schale covered his nose with his snow-white cuff. The authority of the sole God and the obsession of the 8 million. They are rubbing their respective egos against each other upon a membrane a mere few millimeters thick. Regardless of which wins, the original purposefulness of the window to let light pass through and frame the scenery has completely rotted. Edgar's wax-white fingertips chillily look down at the borderline contaminated by primary colours. It is merely a hideous object. Enough, Schale. Let us return. This is no longer architecture, merely the stomach of the forest. The reversing jet-black cloak tore through the freezing air. The moment the heavy bronze doors creaked shut, the creaking of primary colours and gold behind them was completely severed by the thick stone walls. The closed room, having lost its observers, merely froze quietly as meaningless wreckage. Outside the blizzard had stopped, and thin winter sunlight shone through the gaps in the conifers. Treading the fresh snow, the two began to walk through the silent pine forest. Brigman chose the flow of time as the anesthesia for sorrow, didn't he? Schale let his pearl fingertips peek from his snow-white cuffs, innocently flicking the freezing pine needles. Instead of an eternal God, he showed them the shifting seasons of the forest, making them believe that life returns. But it wasn't comforting at all. Naturally, to us, who stand outside of time, the anesthesia known as the cycle of seasons does not work. Edgar's glacial profile spat out cruelly. Purposefulness meant for mortals is merely tedious noise to eternal bystanders. Ah, Edgar. Look, at the end of Schale's lowered gaze, a single reddish-brown squirrel was holding an ice-like nut, gnawing at it busily. Its small, rounded back radiated a certain heat amidst the extreme cold. Cute. With such a small body. Edgar stopped his feet, looking down chillily at the small beast. Fur to survive the extreme cold, and lean feeding behaviour. There exists neither faith in God nor pandering to nature there. A faint sneer floated upon the profile that looked carved from a glacier. Compared to that lump of concrete that lost sight of its own contours, that single beast is a far more perfect purposefulness design. Now, let us return, Schale. Your thoroughly chilled body requires warm tea and lean sugar. End of Volume 18. The Phantom Archives of Edgar the Architect and Schale by Jen Kagami. Volume 20. Taiwan. The altar of the incarnate chimera and the harmony of Jihiban animism fusion. 1. Shell ginger leaves and cloudy millet wine. Hey Edgar. The meat and rice wrapped in this leaf are incredibly chewy and delicious, and my hands are getting all sticky. Around the time when the small metal sphere created by humanity first began to look down upon the Earth from the cold expanse of space. On a tropical island covered in the suffocating silence of martial law in the Katipul settlement of Jiben in eastern Taiwan. In the intense sunlight shining into the cool earthen floor of an old elder's house, Schale was innocently stuffing his cheeks with the traditional Puyuma food abai, wrapped in shell ginger leaves. Enveloping his fragile limbs was an ultra-fine linen shirt, woven to the absolute limit to repel the violence of the humidity and heat rays of this land. The sweaty air clung stickily to his porcelain-like skin. The trichodesma leaves wrapped inside neutralize the pork fat and aid digestion. It is a magnificent logic of survival that perfectly understands the climate and terroir of this land, as well as the structure of the human body. Edgar turned his cold profile like marble completely devoid of moisture and tilted a bisque cup filled with cloudy millet wine. Enveloping his body was an ink-black summer jacket tailored in a highly twisted fresco weave, permitting absolutely no loss of shape, even amidst the maddening humidity of the subtropics. This wine is the same. It is fermented not by time managed by someone, but relying solely on the wild yeast drifting through the suffocating air of these tropics. It is a magnificent design that converted the savagery of nature directly into motive power for the purposefulness of its own intoxication and heat. The place we head to next is the same. It is an architecture like a miracle, where foreign doctrine and the wildness of this soil harmonize at an extreme dimension without killing each other. Edgar quietly delivered his words and stood up. Schale, too, innocently licked the stickiness of the millet off his pearl-coloured fingertips and rose from his seat. Stepping outside, the suffocating scent of greenery and the hot wind roughly whipped the linen shirt. 2. Slate skin and incarnate saints. Wow. It's amazing right from the entrance. Even though it's a Western church, it's covered in black slate stone and undulating wooden carvings. It looks somewhat terribly mysterious. Treading the red clay path, Schale blinked his long eyelashes standing before the Immaculate Conception Church of Gibbon. It is the result of directly translating the Baroque desire for excessive decoration through the indigenous carving techniques of the Puyuma. At this point, it is already tinged with a heat that is no mere imitation. Edgar sank both hands into the pockets of his ink-black jacket and threw open the heavy doors. The interior was dim, with continuous black slate walls that tightened the space heavily. Glancing sideways at the silence of the strange square backrests of the lined-up chairs, Schale looked up at the wooden pillars. "Edgar, look. The ones carved into the pillars are the Virgin Mary and the saints, right? But their features are so deep they look like gods of the forest, a magnificent chimera." The missionaries from Switzerland did not commit the foolish act of bleaching them with pure white Western doctrine. They deeply respected the techniques of this land and the vitality of its animism, incorporating them exactly as they were into the skeleton of the church. The cold sound of shoes struck the stone floor. At the front altar, against a backdrop of black slate and a sequence of rough bamboo, a statue of Christ was raised. A foreign god bears the nature terroir of this land, bamboo and stone. It is an incarnation pure to the point of madness. "Schale, look at the chairs in the side aisles." Prompted by Edgar, Schale, who was approaching the altar, turned his gaze to the side. The moment he did, he gasped. Are these all people?" The single-seat chairs, which from behind looked like mere strange blocks of wood, were, when viewed from the front, a flock of Puyuma wooden carvings clad in geometric traditional attire, staring straight at the altar. Countless wooden people were looking up at the cross in silence. 3. The tremor of the gospel and the frenzy of blessing. Amazing. Everyone is staring intently at the God on the altar. The air is so thick, and somehow my whole body is getting hot. The paintings on the walls and the people on the chairs look like they are about to take a deep breath at any moment. The interior of the church had passed the tranquility of a space for prayer and was dominated by an overwhelming heat of life. From the countless wooden people and the saints on the pillars to the Baroque-style murals painted above the entrance, every form filling the space played a perfect chord, becoming a suffocating vitality that warped their vision. Naturally, the serene prayer of monotheism and the blood-stirring emotion of animism, two vectors that by all rights should never intersect, are infinitely amplifying their thermal mass while blessing each other. This space is now beginning to pulse as a gargantuan heart named prayer. The moment Edgar muttered low, a faint wooden creak grit echoed from the countless wooden chairs filling the hall. It was not the sound of collapse, but the quickening of life. The statues of Mary on the pillars, the saints and the crowds in the murals surpassed the framework of materials, like wood and paint awaiting the words of the priest. The gospel that would soon be spoken, they began to tremble their bodies in rapture. Hide behind my back, Schale. A heat wave of faith that is too pure is crueler than any blade. Your eternity contour, translucent as thin ice, will easily be melted by that suffocating rapture of life. Schale, it comes. The prayer words has begun to spill miracles into reality. Western doctrine and the intense indigenous animism completely harmonize, and all forms awaiting the gospel tremble in rapture, transforming the supposedly inorganic church into the heart of a living forest. To harmonize two gods in a single box and manifest such vitality miracles in the space. It is the pinnacle of a prayer that is too pure. The ink-black jacket flourished. Edgar shielded the faintly trembling pearl-coloured hair behind his back. Around them, the wooden crowds and the people in the murals, having gained life, trembled as if bathing in an invisible shower of the gospel. And the entire space was filled with a blessing light and frenzy bordering on violence. Everyone looks so happy, but it's too hot to stand. If we stay here, it feels like we'll revert to mere earth and leaves. Schale cinched the collar of his linen shirt tightly away from the overflowing vortex of life. The essence of design is always purposefulness, Schale. Did you solve someone's problem in a way only you could, at a higher dimension of beauty or rationality? To resolve two incompatible prayers as such a high-dimensional incarnation, while preserving each's dignity, it is undoubtedly the supreme design. Edgar's wax-white fingertips quietly and seemingly with lingering regret separated from the altar pulsating in rapture. It is perfect. However, it is entirely too alive. For us, cold beings wandering outside of time, the thermal mass of this life is too dazzling. Come, let us return, Schale. This is a beautiful and sacred cradle for the living. The reversing back of cold-blooded cutting tore through the heated air. The moment the heavy doors were closed, the overwhelming trembling of life behind them was completely severed by the thick stone walls. Looking back, the architecture seemed completely assimilated into the surrounding jungle, breathing quietly as a single gargantuan life form. Outside, the intense sun was scorching the suffocating greenery. The two began to walk down the red clay path with their backs to the quiet chimera. The Western god and the god of this island were really good friends, weren't they? Schale let his pearl fingertips peek from his linen cuffs, innocently scooping the humid wind. To combine their powers and create such incredible heat, but it was a little too hot for us, naturally. To us, who live in the frozen time known as eternity, the ultimate life is a lethal dose of poison. Edgar's glacial profile suddenly narrowed softly. The crystallization of living prayer woven by mortals. We were shown something not bad at all. Hey Edgar, that shell ginger leaf over there, at the end of Schale's lowered gaze. In a corner of the church grounds, a thick stem of shell ginger growing from a gap in the stone walls spread, its gargantuan lush leaves bathing in the intense sunlight. Entirely unbothered by the abnormal heat surrounding it, or the heavy pressure of the stone, it merely sucked up the moisture there and swayed in the wind. Even though such an amazing miracle is right beside it, it's blooming beautifully, looking like it doesn't care at all. Edgar stopped his feet, quietly looking down at the fresh green leaves. They are the same. Devouring light, spreading leaves, a perfect survival strategy to circulate its own life. Both that frenzied church space and this single leaf exist on the exact same dimension regarding the purposefulness of connecting life. Deep respect floated upon the profile that looked carved from a glacier. Both that beautifully trembling altar of the chimera and this single leaf taking root in the red earth are equally perfect designs. Now let us go, Schale. We have been slightly too exposed to the suffocating era of earth and blood. Right now we long for inorganic air, coldly managed by steel and glass. End of Volume 20.